Introduction. The Cold Pull, Part 2. The Resonance War and the Encirclement Math. The story so far. The spin is failing. The 666 network, the digital frequency used by the Syndicate to gaslight humanity, is suffering from catastrophic lattice interference. Jason, an architect of the new reality, has achieved the 33-node calibration, moving beyond the reach of the Fox brain room. Above him, the Atlas, a biosynthetic forest ship of impossible scale, has begun to manifest, anchored by the high-frequency scent of the super-tire cannabis crops. The Part 2 arc, chapters 19 to 28. In this segment, the conflict descends from the clouds into the deepest fissures of the Earth. The narrative follows three primary vectors of speculative reality. The Subterranean Audit. While the world watches the skies, the Russians and the Syndicate are locked in a desperate race within the Kola Superdeep and the Pacific Antarctic Ridge. They are hunting for the underground highway, the exotic polymer tubes used by the abominable gardeners to maintain the planet's nervous system. The genetic cipher, the capture of the Navy pilot, the Atlas entity, has revealed the ultimate secret. The human 33 joint foundation isn't an accident of evolution, it is a sovereign frequency. The Syndicate's attempt to graft this DNA into their reptilian hybrids has triggered a planetary temporal ripple, alerting every Sentinel drone in the solar system. The Sealer Encirclement. The UFOs are no longer erratic observers. They have identified themselves as the Seal of the Pause, and the A in the Eye. They are closing in on the hidden dumb bees, deep underground military bases with mathematical precision. The distance to the final day of reckoning is shrinking, and the Syndicate's deepest holes have become their own tombs. The stakes. As the 2026 solar maximum approaches, the planet's electromagnetic shield is thinning, allowing the 144 frequency of the Atlas to overwrite the irony of measures. The owls are retreating, the reptilians are nesting, and the SOA has reached the surface. The cold pull is no longer just a speculative theory, it is a planetary format command. Narrator, the measurements of your cage are an irony. The 33 is not a degree, it is your foundation. Welcome to the afternoon of the great work. Double quote. Michael, the Atlas voice. The Cold Pull, Part 2. A sub-story of the Apollo 20 archive. Chapter 19, The Shepherd's Protocol. Location, the Gold Room, deep underground SCIF, the White House. Date, the 14th of June, 1977. The air in the room didn't move. It was recycled, scrubbed, and chilled to a temperature that made the President of the United States shiver in his cardigan. Jimmy Carter sat at the small steel table, his hands clasped over his personal Bible. Across from him sat the director, a man who didn't exist on any payroll, wreathed in the smoke of a cigar he hadn't bothered to ask permission to light. "You promised me the truth," Carter whispered, his voice sounding thin in the soundproof box. "I asked about the lights in the sky. I asked about the grays. And I am telling you, Mr. President," the director said, his voice like grinding gravel, "that you are asking the wrong questions. You are worried about the tourists. You should be worried about the landlord." The director clicked a wired remote. The carousel projector on the table clattered. Clack whoosh. A grainy, high-contrast image hit the concrete wall. It was aerial reconnaissance, taken from the stratosphere. It showed a blinding expanse of white ice, broken by a massive, needle-shaped shadow buried deep beneath the glaze. "Coordinates, Wilkesland, Antarctica," the director recited anomaly. "We know better. It is the Atlas." "The Russians think it's a magnetic." Carter leaned in, squinting. "A weapon. A lifeboat, sir. Left here by the progenitors, the civilization that built this nursery before the last reset. It isn't designed to fight. It is designed to stitch reality back together." The director clicked again. The image shifted to a topographic scan of the same area. Deep below the ice, pulsing in red thermal lines, was a second structure, a perfect, obsidian black pyramid connected to the ship by massive subterranean cables. "And that," the director pointed with his cigar, "is the spark plug, the Schumann capacitor. It's a planetary grounding rod. It's turning on. Jimmy. That's why the ice is melting from the bottom up. The engine is warming up. Double quote. Warming up for what? Carter asked, and not forming in his stomach. For the departure. The ship is leaving. It's trying to take us to the next room, Bubble 34, the higher resolution Earth. Carter sat back, a flicker of his famous optimism returning. It's what the scriptures promised. Then, this is good news. Salvation. The director laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. If it were just the ship, yes, but a lifeboat is useless if the passengers are chained to the dock. He clicked the remote. Clack whoosh. The image on the wall changed. It was no longer a map. It was a medical scan, an MRI of a human brain. But there was something wrong with it. A dark, nebulous shadow was wrapped tightly around the brain stem, its tendrils digging into the base of the skull. What am I looking at? Carter asked. This, the director said, is the Vermis Rex, the king worm. It is an etheric biological implant. It sits on the medulla oblongata, the reptile brain. A tumor. A governor, Mr. President. A limiter. It filters the visual cortex. It edits reality before your conscious mind even sees it. If a UFO flies over the White House, this thing scrubs it from your vision. If you try to access higher consciousness, it floods your system with cortisol. It keeps you scared. It keeps you small. Carter touched the back of his own neck, a reflex. Who put it there? The Archons, the director said, dropping the word like a stone. Parasitic entities from a collapsed dimension. They don't want us to leave on the Atlas, Jimmy. They want us to stay here, reincarnating, fighting, suffering, because that energy, that loosh, is what they eat. We aren't a civilization to them. We are a feedlot. Carter stared at the shadow on the wall. The horror of it washed over him. The wars, the famines, the endless, grinding misery of human history. It wasn't bad luck. It was farming. My God, Carter choked out. Tears welled in his eyes, hot and sudden. He looked down at his Bible. Then, there is no hope. We are just cattle. The director watched the president weep. He let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. Then, slowly, he reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a heavy alabaster vial, sealed with ancient wax. He slid it across the metal table. There is a way to remove the cuff, the director said softly. Carter looked up, wiping his eyes. He reached for the vial. It smelled of pine, cinnamon, and skunk. What is it? The shepherd's protocol, the director said. Anoint the heads of his sheep with oil. You know your Bible, Jimmy. Why did David Carter blinked, the Sunday school lesson surfacing through the trauma? To keep the flies out. The bot flies. They would burrow into the ears and drive the sheep mad. Exactly, the director nodded. The parasites hate the oil. This isn't just ritual, sir. It's chemistry. This is the Canic Bossum, 250 shekels of pure, extracted liquid gold. It changes the dielectric frequency of your nervous system. It raises your body's voltage. If you pour this on your head, the heat is too high for the shadow. The parasite detaches. It burns off. Carter clutched the vial. Then we give this to the people. We mass produce it. We free them. The director's hand shot out. He snatched the vial back from Carter's grip with shocking speed. No, Mr. President. We do not. Why? Carter pleaded, his voice cracking. If this is the cure. Because a sheep without parasites doesn't need a shepherd, the director hissed, slipping the vial back into his pocket. If the people take this, they wake up. They see the Atlas. They see the Archons standing on their backs. They see us. The director stood up, gathering his files. We kept the prohibition for a reason, Jimmy. We keep the sheep itching, because itching sheep are easy to herd. The Atlas is leaving in 2027. Until then, your job is to keep them grazing. He clicked the remote one last time. A graph appeared, a red line spiking vertically at the date. 2025. The terminal harvest is coming, the director said, walking to the heavy steel door. Let them panic. Fear makes the meat taste better. Try not to. The door slam shut. Jimmy Carter sat alone in the dark, the spectral blue light of the Atlas schematic illuminating his tear-streaked face. He opened his Bible, but the words looked different now. They weren't promises. They were instructions he had been forbidden to share. Cut to Groom Lake, Nevada. Designation, the 51st state. Time, 300 hours. The Learjet touched down on the tarmac, tires screeching against the asphalt of the longest runway on Earth. There were no lights guiding it in. The pilots flew by instrument only, navigating the pitch-black void of the desert. The director stepped onto the stairs, the dry heat of the Nevada night hitting him like a physical blow. He didn't look at the mountains. He knew the snipers were there. He knew the camo dudes in the white jeeps were watching the perimeter. He wasn't in America anymore. He was in dreamland. He walked to the waiting black sedan. The driver didn't salute. Here, rank meant nothing. Clearance was the only currency. How did he take it? The driver asked, staring straight ahead. He cried, the director said, lighting a fresh cigar, worrying about interest rates. They always cry. Then they go back to the car didn't drive to the hangars. It drove into the side of the Papoose mountain range, disappearing into a camouflage tunnel that spiraled down, mile after mile, into the crust of the earth. They passed level 1, the avionics lab. They passed level 3, the biology lab, the zoo. They stopped at level 9. The air here smelled different. It smelled of ozone and ancient, rusted iron. The director swiped his badge, a black card with no name, only a gold embossed triangle. The heavy blast doors hissed open. This was the Martian seat. The room was a perfect cylinder, walls lined with red rock that hadn't been quarried on Earth. The stone hummed. It was a chunk of Cydonia, transported here piece by piece in the 1950s. In the center of the room sat the throne. It wasn't a chair. It was an interface, a jagged, obsidian control pod salvaged from the ruins of the Martian collapse 100,000 years ago. It was the command deck for a civilization that had already destroyed its own planet, and moved here to feed on ours. A figure was waiting in the shadows, tall, humanoid, but wearing a suit that shimmered like oil on water. The puppet, the figure asked. The voice didn't come from a mouth, it vibrated directly into the director's skull. Pacified, the director replied, bowing his head slightly, he is protecting them. He believes the narrative. He believes good, the voice hummed. They panic. It sours the vintage. The herd must remain calm. The cortisol levels are distinct when the figure stepped forward. Under the harsh halogen lights, the human disguise flickered. For a split second, the director saw the truth: the vertical pupils, the scales, the ancient, cold intelligence of the old Mars aristocracy. The entity sat in the Martian seat. The red stone of the room lit up, responding to its genetic signature. A holographic map of Earth appeared, identical to the one Carter saw, but this one wasn't a warning. It was a menu. The Atlas is stirring, the director warned. The vibrations in the ice are increasing. Let it stir, the entity smiled, its hand stroking the controls of the seat. We have the blue beam, we have the neural cuff, and we have the 51st state to enforce the silence. When the ship rises, we will paint it as a demon, and your monkeys will nuke their own savior. The director nodded. As you command. Go, the entity dismissed him, stocked for the harvest. Prepare, the grid 2025 is approaching. We need the pen fully. The director turned and walked back toward the elevator, leaving the Martian king alone in the red dark, plotting the end of the world from the safety of the American dream. The auditors. Location, Sublevel 8, the Dead Letter Office. Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. Designation, 509th Special Projects Division. Time, 315 hours. The room did not look like a military bunker. It looked like an insurance office from the 1950s, beige walls, linoleum floors, rows of grey filing cabinets. But the geometry was wrong. If you looked at the corners of the room too long, your eyes began to water. The angles added up to more than 360 degrees. This was a tesseract shield. The entire office existed in a pocket dimension, slightly out of phase with the rest of the base to prevent eavesdropping by the Soviets or the Atlas. Major Vane, the father of the current nemesis, sat at a desk made of a material that looked like polished obsidian, but felt like warm skin. He did not sweat, despite the humidity. He wore a black suit that absorbed light, cut from a fabric that didn't wrinkle because it wasn't woven, it was grown. On his desk sat the artifact. It wasn't a radio. It was a dodecahedron made of a silvery gold metal, or a chalcum. It floated 3 inches above the desk surface, spinning silently in a counterclockwise rotation against gravity. Hum. The dodecahedron stopped spinning. One face of the geometric shape turned translucent, glowing with a deep, blood-red light. A message printed itself directly onto Vane's retina, not text, but a packet of pure conceptual data. Sender, the seat level 9. Status, executive pacification complete. Data, subject Carter has accepted the narrative. The cuff remains active. The Shepherd's protocol is secure. Vane didn't blink. He processed the data with the detached efficiency of a machine. He tapped the obsidian desk. Acknowledged, Vane said. He didn't speak into a microphone. He spoke into the crystal. The vibration of his voice was captured, encrypted into a scalar wave, and shot back to Nevada instantly. He stood up and walked to the wall of filing cabinets. He opened drawer 1947. Double quote. Inside, there were no papers. The drawer was a stasis field. Floating in blue suspension gel was a severed hand, gray, 4 fingers, with suction cup tips. He checked the biometrics on the hand. It was still twitching, reacting to the message from the Martian seat. The president is back in his box, Vane said to the other man in the room. Agent K, no relation to the movies, a pale, hairless man who smelled faintly of ozone, looked up from a monitor that was tracking global UFO sightings. And the Atlas? Agent K asked. His voice was monotone. Stirring, Vane replied the counter-narrative. The director says the ice is melting. The entity says we proceed with. Vane walked to the massive window. It didn't look outside. It looked into the containment chamber next door. Inside the chamber hung the sport model. The pristine, 30-foot polished disc recovered from Kingman, Arizona in 1953. Technicians in hazmat suits were welding a new component onto its hull, a United States Air Force logo. We have 10 years to build a fleet, Vane said, watching the sparks fly. When the Atlas arrives, the world won't see a savior. They'll see an invasion force, and thanks to Carter's silence, we'll have the budget to shoot it down. Vane turned back to the dodecahedron. It had started spinning again, erasing the message. File the Carter briefing under resolved, Vane ordered. Time we started writing the script for the end of the world. An initiate Project Blue Beam. Its Agent K nodded. It will be a blockbuster, sir. Double quote. The flask in the fire. Location, Site Omega Deep Lithosphere Command Deck, 40 miles beneath Denver. Ambient external temperature, 1,200 degrees Celsius or 2,192 degrees Fahrenheit. Internal office temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The only thing separating Director Vane from instant incineration was a hum. It was a low, throbbing vibration in the floorboards, the sound of the thermal inversion cryo pumps. His office was not a room. It was a vacuum flask suspended in a bubble of molten rock. The engineering was a masterpiece of desperation. The base sucked in the lethal heat of the mantle, ran it through massive diamond-coated turbines to generate gigawatts of electricity, and then used that very power to supercool the interior air. It was a closed loop of survival. If the turbines hiccuped for 3 seconds, the cooling field would collapse. The walls would glow cherry red. The air in his lungs would turn to steam. He was sitting inside an ice cube heaved into a furnace, betting his life that the ice wouldn't melt. Vane smoothed the lapel of his suit. He looked calm, but his eyes were fixed on the Delta T readout on his desk. External, 2,192 degrees Fahrenheit. Internal, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He was a flea living on the back of a sleeping dragon, convinced he was driving the beast. The Trojan horse. He turned his chair to the reinforced view screen. It didn't show the rock wall, it showed a live feed from the containment lab above, where the pilot, Vitriol, was being prepped. For years, Vane had congratulated himself on the moon heist. The discovery of the Atlas, buried in the lunar regolith, had been the 509th's greatest triumph. They had cracked the code, bypassed the Sentinels, and extracted the dormant biological key, the pilot right from under the nose of the cosmic quarantine. But now, staring at the telemetry, a cold knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. It was too easy. Why would a civilization capable of building a dimensional needle like the Atlas leave it parked on a dead moon, half buried in dust, with the keys in the ignition? It wasn't left behind, Vane realized, the ice in his drink clinking as his hand trembled slightly. It was staged. They hadn't stolen a weapon, they had swallowed a pill. The Atlas wasn't a ship waiting to be claimed. It was the bio-law. It sat there for eons, emitting a low-frequency signal that appealed specifically to the greed of the Arcan-infected mind. It wanted to be brought here. It needed to be brought deep into the gravity well of Earth, into the heart of the infection, so that when it finally woke up, as it was doing now, it would detonate from the inside. He hadn't captured the pilot. He had personally escorted the bomb into his own bunker. The Violet Neighbors. Vane keyed the monitor to channel 9, the deep feed. Double quote. The screen flickered, shifting spectrums to penetrate the rock density below. The image resolved. Miles beneath his flask, the ancient lava tubes were not dark. They were glowing. A soft, rhythmic violet light pulsed through the obsidian veins of the planet. It was the bioluminescence of the cryptoterrestrials. He watched them, tall, slender figures moving with a fluid grace that made his own militarized movements look jerky and primitive. They were walking along the banks of the magma rivers, tending to massive, crystalline structures that grew out of the rock like glass orchards. They were the gardeners, the caretakers. They weren't hiding, they didn't have blast doors or security checkpoints. They walked in the open, protected by a technology Vane couldn't crack, sovereign frequency. His sensors showed the Martian grey clones scuttling in the shadows of the upper tunnels, terrified of the violet light. The Greys knew. The Reptilians knew. They were technically neighbors, but the dynamic was clear. The cryptoterrestrials were the homeowners. Vane and his cabal were just the termites in the attic. The can of raid. On the screen, one of the violet figures stopped. It turned its head. It looked up. Through miles of solid granite, through the stealth shielding of the DUMB, through the camera lens, it looked directly at Vane. Vane flinched. The figure didn't look angry. It looked patient. It looked like a man who has finally decided to go to the garage, grab the flashlight and the pesticide, and deal with the infestation in the walls. The violet light in the tubes began to brighten. It wasn't a gentle pulse anymore. It was strobing. The frequency was rising. Vane looked back at his desk. The Delta T readout flickered. External temp, rising. The ancients weren't attacking. They were simply waking up the Earth. And for a parasite that requires the dark and the cold to survive, the sunrise is not beautiful. It is lethal. Vane hit the intercom button, his voice cracking just once before snapping back into the cold, dead monotone of the bureaucrat. "Initiate the extraction," he said. "Get the pilot to the chair. We are out of time." The countdown hadn't started today. It had started the moment they touched the moon. And now, the clock was at 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 1 second. The law. 1. The needle in the haystack, Vitriol. Location, the Sandbox Classified Training Facility, Nevada Desert. Timeline, pre-mission, Operation, Lunar Grab. Vitriol sat strapped into the pilot's cradle of the MKIV extraction skiff. It was a bastardized piece of engineering, half Lockheed Martin rigidity, half reverse-engineered sport model fluidity. They called it a BOIV variant, Biological Operations Insertion Vehicle, but stripped of its sea-pressure hull and hardened for the vacuum of the lunar regolith. He ran his gloved hands over the interface. It was a nightmare of haptic feedback loops and analog fail-safes. "Check containment seals," The comms buzzed in his ear. If the biostasis fails during the grab, the asset liquefies. If the G-dampeners fail, you liquefy. Verify tolerance. Vitriol didn't answer. He adjusted the grapple frequency. The mission was insane. They weren't just landing on the moon. They were drilling into a specific fissure in the Tycho crater, a crack that shouldn't exist, to pull a biological entity out of a ship that had been sleeping for 1,000,000 years. He looked at the simulation screen. The target wasn't a cargo crate. It was a chair. And in the chair was him. The intel boys called it the sleeper. Vitriol called it the battery. His orders were clear: do not wake it up. Just disconnect the umbilical, seal it in the hyperbaric coffin, and boost back to the orbiter before the Atlas defenses realized the pilot was gone. Tolerance is green, Vitriol whispered, his voice vibrating through the bone conduction mic. Let's go steal a god. Double quote. 2. The painting of the door, the gardener. Location: 2 miles east of Dulce Base, New Mexico, Archuleta Mesa. Time: twilight. The creature crouched in the shadow of a pinyon pine. To a hiker, he would have looked like a trick of the light, a massive, hairy stump or a bear standing on 2 legs. But the Sasquatch was not an animal, he was a sentry. He watched the black triangular drone buzz silently out of the false rock face on the ridge below. The termites were active tonight. The creature didn't roar. He reached into the matted fur of his chest bandolier and pulled out a quartz rod, roughly the size of a human forearm, wrapped in copper wire. He wasn't hunting the drone. He was targeting it. He pointed the crystal at the hidden hangar door as it slid open to admit the craft. He closed his eyes and hummed a subaudible tone, a frequency that resonated with the piezoelectric properties of the quartz. Pulse. An invisible beam of coherent information shot from the crystal, passing through the camouflage, through the blast doors, and embedding a digital scent into the rock. He wasn't destroying the base. He was painting it for the inner cities. Below the crust, the Violet Guardians would see this marker on their screens. A glowing red X that said, "Here is the rot. Here is the entrance. When the time comes, breach here." The Sasquatch lowered the rod, blinked his large, reflective eyes, and then, with a shimmer of heat haze, shifted his density and vanished into the frequency of the trees. 3. The spider in the web, the pilot. Location: the Moon Tycho sector, inside the Atlas sarcophagus. Timeline: moments before extraction. He sat in the chair. He had been sitting there for 12,000 years, or perhaps 12 minutes. Time, in this state, was a fluid he could drink or spit out at will. The pilot, the entity the humans would soon designate as the asset, was small. His biological form was frail, almost translucent, a slip of pale skin stretched over bird-like bones. Without the armor of the ship around him, he was physically helpless. A stiff breeze would break him. But his mind was a supernova. He felt the vibration of Vitriol's ship approaching the lunar surface. He felt the crude, hungry radar sweeps of the humans trying to locate the fissure. They think they found a crack, the pilot thought, a ripple of amusement passing through his neural network. They do not see that I opened the door. The fissure in the crater wasn't erosion. It was an invitation. He checked the Atlas diagnostics. The ship was fully powered, humming with the terrifying potential of a restrained star. He could have vaporized the approaching human vessel with a single thought. He could have raised the shields and remained buried for another eon. But that was not the plan. To defeat the infection, the medicine must be swallowed. He had to be taken. He had to let these primitive, greedy creatures disconnect him from his throne, wrap his fragile body in their clumsy plastic sheets, and drag him down into the darkness of their underground hell. He had to go into the stomach of the beast, the DUMB, so that he could detonate the light from the inside. The pilot closed his large, black eyes. He slowed his heart rate to 1 beat per year. He disengaged the ship's active defenses. "Come, little thieves," he projected into the void. "The door is unlocked. The treasure is waiting." Above him, the ceiling of the cavern began to grind open, and the first blinding beam of a human searchlight cut through the dust of ages, falling upon his face. He didn't flinch. He waited. The silent hangar. The eyes of Captain Charles Chuck Halloway were blue, wide, and fixed on a point in space that no longer existed. In his mind, it was the 21st of July, 1968. He was at 35,000 feet, reaching for the flap controls of his Douglas DC-8, preparing to bank away from a strange, glowing fog bank over the Pacific. His heart was hammering at 120 beats per minute. A scream was rising in his throat. That scream had been rising for 58 years. He was not in the Pacific. He was 2 miles beneath the ice shelf of New Swabia, Antarctica, suspended in the gravimetric embrace of the Kronos archive. If he could blink, if the amber gel of the stasis field allowed him even a single synapse of movement, he would have seen that he was not alone. Below his cockpit, spiraling down into the abyss of the cavern like a mobile of ghosts, was the history of human disappearance. To his left, the wooden hull of a Spanish galleon, its sails stiff and yellowed, hung perfectly motionless. Below that, the rust-streaked iron of the USS Cyclops. Further down, the twin-engine Avengers of Flight 19, flying in a tight, eternal formation. And deeper still, fading into the gloom, the ore banks of a Roman trireme. 2,000 years of missing persons. 2,000 years of trophies. They hung in the silent dark, preserved in the exact microsecond of their abduction, a museum of terror where the exhibits were still breathing. A door hissed open on the catwalk gantry suspended above the DC-8's nose. Director Vane stepped out, the click of his heels on the metal grate echoing like gunshots in a cathedral. He didn't look at the ships. He had seen them 1,000 times. They were clutter. Infantry. He walked to the edge of the railing and looked down, not at the planes, but past them. Far below the bottommost ship, the cave floor ended. It didn't taper off, it simply stopped, opening into a hexagonal void 10 miles wide. The Southern Iris. The throat of the world. A cold, synthetic wind blew up from the pit, carrying the smell of ozone and ancient dust. Down there, past the crushing pressure of the mantle, lay the prize, the inner sun, the Agartha network, the original domain that his masters, the reptilian high command, had lost eons ago. And it was currently locked tight. Status, Vane said, his voice flat. From the shadows of the gantry, a tall, spindly figure emerged. It was a grey, but not one of the drone workers. This one wore the high-collared crimson robe of the science caste. Its telepathic voice slithered into Vane's mind, tasting of dry paper and static. The barrier remains absolute, Director. The crypto-terrestrial wardens have modulated the frequency. Any biological entity with a resonant vibration below 400 Hz is incinerated upon entry. Vane gripped the railing, his knuckles whitening. How quaint. 400 Hz, the frequency of love. It was the ultimate firewall. The ancients, the hairy giants, the Sasquatch, the gardeners who guarded the inner earth didn't use guns. They used vibration. They had turned the entrance into a spiritual filter. If you were a creature of fear, conquest, or greed, like the Martians, the very air of the tunnel would boil your blood. You physically could not descend. The Martian armies were massed in the upper caverns, millions of soldiers, thousands of tripod walkers, all dressed up with nowhere to go. They were wolves scratching at a glass door. We cannot lower our vibration to pass, Vane muttered. So we must wear a suit that can. He turned his gaze back to the DC-8. He looked through the cockpit glass, directly into the frozen, terrified eyes of Captain Halloway. Why him? Vane asked, though he knew the answer. He just liked hearing the logic. It calmed him. Subject Halloway, lineage confirmed, Rh negative, direct descendant of the Atlantean priesthood. His energetic signature is bright. Bright enough to fool the senses. If we excise the consciousness and hollow out the vessel, yes, the energetic residue of his DNA will act as a passkey. We can cloak the Vanguard unit in his frequency. To the gardeners, the invasion force will look like a returning pilgrim. Vane smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a Miller-style smile. A Trojan horse made of meat, Vane whispered. Open the cockpit. Double quote. He is still conscious in the freeze. Director, if we breach the field, the temporal shock will shatter his mind. I don't need his mind, Vane said, pulling a syringe from his coat pocket. The needle was made of black glass, pulsing with a faint green like the vitriol compound, but inverted. I need his ghosts. A hum filled the cavern as the gantry arm extended, moving Vane closer to the suspended plane. The stasis field shimmered, a bubble of frozen time rippling as the mechanical arm pushed through it. Captain Holloway's eyes were still locked on the phantom fog of 1968. He couldn't see the man in the black coat floating towards his window. He couldn't see the needle. He couldn't know that his blood was about to become the key that would unlock hell. Vane pressed his hand against the cold glass of the cockpit. "Thank you for your service, Captain," Vane whispered. "You are about to be the first human to visit the inner world in 10,000 years. Pity you won't be awake to enjoy the view." Below them, the hexagon waited. The Martian armies shifted in the dark, their weapons charged, waiting for the signal that the door was finally open. The ascending ghost. Vane turned his back on the frozen terror of Captain Holloway. The cockpit glass fogged slightly with the heat of his breath, a fleeting mark on a tomb of ice. He walked to the edge of the gantry, where the darkness of the cavern floor dropped away into the impossible geometry of the southern iris. He hated this hole. It was not just a geological feature, it was a graveyard of ambition. For 50 years, the Syndicate had thrown their best technology and their brightest meat into that throat, and the throat had swallowed them whole. Vane closed his eyes, and the failures played out on the back of his eyelids like a black box recording. The submarine, 1978. The USS Scorpia, a prototype stealth vessel sheathed in acoustic dampening tiles, attempting the wet entry via the suboceanic lava tubes that connected the South Sandwich Trench to the inner mantle. Vane remembered the audio feed. There was no explosion, no crunch of collapsing bulkheads. Just the screaming. The crew hadn't drowned. As they crossed the dimensional threshold into the Agartha waters, the molecular density of the ocean changed. The water became living plasma. It passed right through the steel hull. The last thing the hydrophones recorded was the sound of the crew trying to breathe water that was burning with high-frequency light. They didn't die, they transmuted. The pilots, 1994. Operation High Jump 2. 3TR-3B Astra triangles, reverse-engineered from the Roswell crash, flown by the USAF's most elite Solar Warden pilots. They had the speed, they had the stealth, but they didn't have the mind. The moment the squadron hit the psychic firewall, that invisible 400 Hz membrane that guarded the inner world, the neural interfaces of the ships backfired. The pilots' brains, wired directly into the flight computers, couldn't process the sudden shift from 3D logic to 5D reality. Their temporal lobes liquefied. Vane had seen the recovery photos. The helmets were intact, but inside, there was nothing but soup. The ships had drifted listlessly into the ice walls, scraping down the obsidian glass like dead leaves. And then, there was him. Vane opened his eyes and looked at the holographic display floating near the railing. A single, pulsing red dot hovered on the wireframe map of the tunnel, deep in the crust. Depth, 60 miles. Status, signal active. Subject 7, Major Thomas Vance. This was the failure that kept Vane awake at night. Vance had been perfect. The right bloodline, the right Rh-negative markers. He was a starseed candidate, genetically compatible with the ancient defense systems. He hadn't used a ship, he had used a grav chute, a single-man drop pod designed to harmonize with the tunnel's frequency. He had fallen, and fallen. He had passed the barrier, the alarms hadn't triggered, the Guardians hadn't incinerated him. Vane remembered the euphoria in the control room. He's in. He's actually in. But then, the telemetry changed. Vance didn't land. He didn't report. He just stopped. He wasn't dead. His biomonitor was still transmitting a heartbeat, slow, rhythmic, calm. But he wasn't moving forward. The red dot on the screen blinked. Ping, ping, ping. He is still ascending, Vane whispered to the empty air. That was the horror of it. The signal wasn't stationary. For the last 10 years, the signal had been slowly, agonizingly moving up the shaft, not climbing, floating. Whatever was down there hadn't killed Major Vance. It had caught him. It had suspended him in a beam of pure light, a fly in amber, and was slowly pushing him back up toward the surface, inch by inch, year by year. A warning. Look at your champion. Look at your best biology. We didn't even fight him. We just turned him off. Vane turned back to Holloway's frozen face. The rage in his chest burned cold and sharp. Vance failed because he was alive, Vane muttered, tapping the glass of the DC-8 soul. And souls can be caught. Souls can be judged. He looked at the syringe in his hand, the black vitriol swirling. But you, Captain, you are empty. You are just a suit. And the dead have nothing to fear from judgment. Vane signaled the Grey Technician. Initiate the extraction. Prepare the corpse for insertion. We are not knocking on the door this time. We are breaking the lock. Far below, in the deep dark, the red dot of Major Vance continued its silent, ascending drift, a ghost in the machine, watching the next victim prepare to fall. The lunar key. Vane lowered the black glass syringe, the needle hovering just inches from the DC-8's fuselage. The green light of the inverted vitriol pulsed in the barrel like a trapped heartbeat. He didn't inject it. Not yet. He looked at Captain Holloway's frozen, terrified face. It was a crude instrument, a blunt object. You are a crowbar, Captain, Vane whispered, his reflection ghosting over the pilot's cheek. And one does not use a crowbar if one still has a chance to steal the master key. Double quote. He turned away from the suspended aircraft, his long coat snapping as he walked back to the edge of the gantry. The holographic map of the southern iris still spun in the air, the red dot of Major Vance, the ascending ghost blinking its eternal warning from the depths, unworthy. 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 The Grey Technician waited in the shadows, its large black eyes unblinking. The extraction protocol is ready, Director. Shall we proceed with the excision of the human subject? Pause it, Vane said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent hangar. Maintain the gel pressure, but do not harvest him yet. Keep Holloway in stasis. Logic query. The invasion window is narrowing. The alignment of the inner sun is. I know the alignment, Vane snapped, the car mask slipping for a microsecond to reveal the reptile beneath. He composed himself, smoothing his lapel. But Holloway is damaged goods. Look at him. He is frozen in a scream. His adrenals are flooded with terror. Even if we scrub his DNA, even if we cloak him in the vitriol, he reeks of fear. Vane gestured to the abyss of the tunnel entrance. The gardeners down there, the Sasquatch sentinels, they don't see with eyes. They see resonance. If we send a vessel that vibrates with the frequency of a victim, the barrier will reject it. We might get 10 miles down before the walls start singing and liquefy the invasion force. He tapped a command into the console, and the map of Antarctica vanished. It was replaced by a rotating, higher-resolution sphere of the moon. Vane zoomed in on the dark side, specifically the Mare Moscovines region, where a faint, golden signal pulsed from beneath the lunar crust. This, Vane said softly, a look of religious avarice crossing his face, that matters. This is the only biology. The Patriarch, the Grey stated, its telepathic voice dipping in reverence. The pilot of the First Age, Vane corrected. The Atlas progenitor. He traced the golden signal on the lunar map. We have confirmed the location of the sarcophagus. He has been there for 12,000 years, preserved in a vacuum stasis that makes our technology look like stone knives. His DNA isn't just human, it is source code. Double quote. Vane turned to the Grey, his eyes gleaming. Think about it. The inner world, Agartha, was built by his kind. The barrier, the gravity wells, the Sasquatch guardians, they are all programmed to obey him. He walked back to the railing, looking down at the impenetrable darkness of the 10-mile abyss. If I possess the blood of the Patriarch, if I coat myself in the frequency of a god, I won't need to sneak past the guardians. I won't need to fight. He smiled, a cold, predatory expression. With perfect DNA, the gardeners will not see an invader. They will see the king returning home. They will lower the shields. They will open the gates wide. He looked back at the frozen DC-8 pilot. Holloway was a desperation play, a suicide vest disguised as a diplomat. But the patriarch, that was absolute power. Keep the pilot on ice, Vane ordered, turning his back on the Museum of the Dead. But prepare the Dark Fleet for a lunar insertion. We are going to wake the sleeper. Here's plan, and when we have fish blood, Vane whispered to the empty air, the abyss will welcome us with open arms. There will be no stopping us. Chapter 20, The High Gain Antenna. St. Kitts, West Indies. The 10th of December, 2005. The air in the executive suite of the Marriott was still, conditioned to a sterile 72 degrees. But the air inside Jason's head was vibrating at a much higher altitude. He sat at the head of the heavy, oval mahogany dining table, a table meant for six, for corporate dinners and polite conversation. Tonight, it was a command center for one. There was no coffee cup. There was no glass of rum, the old island anesthetic he used to pour at 10 a.m., to dull the sharp edges of the world. That phase was over. He wasn't trying to sleep through the nightmare anymore. He was trying to decode it. Resting in the heavy crystal ashtray was a hand-rolled spliff, the smoke curling up in a perfect, lazy spiral toward the ceiling vent. He took a drag, holding the smoke deep. It wasn't about getting stoned. It was about the shift. The cannabis acted like a lens cleaner for his perception. The rum used to make the wrongness of the world blurry and tolerable. The herb made it sharp, crystalline, and terrifyingly obvious. He felt more awake than he had in years. The static of the official narrative fell away, leaving only the raw signal. To his right, leaning against the beige wall like silent sentinels, lay his wings. They were not just surfboards, they were precision instruments of escape. The primary, a Fanatic 110-liter, a beast of a board, fast and stable, designed to plane early and carry him across the chop of the Atlantic-Caribbean confluence. The Scalpel, a Fanatic 96-liter waveboard, narrower, twitchier, built for the days when the trade winds howled and the swells stood up like walls. Next to them, rolled in tight, disciplined bundles, was the Quiver, 5 sails, covering every wind range from gentle breeze to God's wrath. 2 booms and 2 carbon fiber masts lay parallel on the floor, the skeletal structure of his freedom. He looked at the gear with a mix of love and unease. He had bought them to play in the elements, but looking at the laptop screen, he realized the elements were being rigged. The screen glowed blue in the dim room. The blog post was open. Armageddon, the 10th of December, 2005. He exhaled a long plume of smoke and began to type, the keys clacking with a rhythm that matched the manic clarity in his mind. They tell you Katrina was bad luck. They tell you Wilma was a freak of nature. But nature doesn't paint by numbers. Double quote. He looked at the Fanatic boards. He knew wind. He knew how it felt to be harnessed to the atmosphere. Holding a 5.0-meter sail against a 25-knot gust, you developed a feel for the breath of the planet. And 2005 didn't feel like breath. It felt like engine exhaust. I'm sitting here with 5 sails and 2 boards, waiting for the wind, he typed. But the wind feels synthetic. It feels steered. We are watching a game of billiards played with low-pressure systems, and New Orleans was just the corner pocket. Double quote. He took another hit from the spliff, the embers glowing bright orange. The paranoia, or was it prescience, washed over him. He was a stranger in a strange land, an expat hiding in a luxury hotel, armed with a quiver of high-tech windsurfing gear and a brain that was suddenly, violently allergic to the lies on CNN and Fox. It's not weather, Jason whispered to the empty chairs, the smoke drifting over the table like a localized storm front. It's warfare. He looked at the 96-liter waveboard. And we're going to need a faster board to outrun what's coming. He hit publish. The cursor blinked, the smoke swirled, and somewhere deep in the Atlantic, the next anomaly began to spin. The Temple and the Tube. St. Kitts, West Indies. Looking back at July 2005. The Marriott suite was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner and the rhythmic tapping of Jason's fingers. The spliff in the crystal ashtray had burned down to a roach, leaving a pungent, resinous haze that hung low over the mahogany table like a localized weather system. Jason wasn't surfing today. The trade winds were howling outside, rattling the palm fronds, a perfect 25-knot day for the 96-liter waveboard, and a 4.7-meter sail, but he couldn't leave the screen. He was deep in the archives of July. He had missed it when it happened, too busy trying to forget the world, but now, with the cannabis lens fully engaged, the pattern of the summer of 2005 was resolving into a terrifying geometry. It wasn't just the hurricanes, it was the ritual. He had two windows open on his heavy Dell laptop. Window 1, NASA Deep Impact Mission. Window 2, the London 7/7 bombings. He looked at the dates. The 4th of July, 2005, NASA slams a 370-kilogram copper impactor into Comet Tempel 1. The 7th of July, 2005, 3 bombs detonate on the London Underground, and 1 on a bus. 3 days, Jason whispered, smoke drifting from his lips window. 3 days, the resurrection. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the technical specs of the NASA mission. A $330 million budget, 33, the master number, and the target, Tempel 1. They bombed the temple in the heavens, Jason muttered, the realization hitting him like a rogue wave. As above, so below, they strike the celestial temple on Independence Day, ringing the comet like a bell, and the resonance travels down to Earth, manifesting as an explosion in the financial capital of the old empire 3 days later. It was an energetic circuit, a spell cast with rocket fuel and copper slugs. He switched to the London window. The official story was a mess of contradictions, but one clip played on a loop in his mind: the interview with Peter Power of Visor Consultants. At 9:30 this morning, we were actually running an exercise for a company of over 1,000 people in London based on simultaneous bombs going off precisely at the railway stations where it happened this morning, so I still have the hairs on the back of my neck standing up right now. Double quote. Jason paused the video. He stared at the man's face. It wasn't a coincidence, Jason said to the silent fanatic boards leaning against the wall. The script. They were running the simulation and the live event on the same channel. It was. And then, the cleanup. He opened a third window, the 21st of July, 2005. 2 weeks later, 4 more devices, 4 duds. The media called it a failed second wave. Jason called it a patch. The first one was too perfect, he analyzed, his mind racing. The drill match was too obvious. The timing with the comet was too esoteric. The public was starting to ask questions. So what do you do? He took a drag of the roach, feeling the heat on his fingertips. You create a messy sequel. You send out some patsies with backpacks that don't explode. You create panic without casualties. It muddies the waters. It makes the terror look chaotic and incompetent, instead of precise and engineered. He looked at the quiver of sails, high-tech mylar and carbon fiber, designed to harness invisible forces. He realized the news was just another form of wind. It was an invisible force, steered by unseen hands, designed to push the human herd in a specific direction. July 2005 wasn't a month. It was a seance. They hit the comet, fire from heaven. They hit the tubes, fire from below. They used the 33 and the 77. Jason closed the laptop, the screen going black. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The simple life was a lie. There was no island remote enough to escape this. The grid covered everything, from the ice of Antarctica to the comets in deep space. He looked at the 110-liter board. We're going to need to learn how to sail through a hurricane, he whispered. Weather is only going to get worse. Because the shedding of skins. St. Kitts, West Indies. Recall, the weeks before the end. The Marriott suite was quiet, but Jason's mind was replaying the crash of his former life like a slow-motion demolition derby. To the outside world, Jason was a man whose life was imploding. In the span of a fortnight, He had lost his career and his congregation. He had been stripped of his title and his tribe. But sitting at the mahogany table with the spliff burning in the crystal tray, Jason didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a snake that had finally scraped off a layer of dead skin that was too tight to breathe in. He looked at the laptop screen, where the date, the 10th of December, 2005, pulsed like a heartbeat. The stripping away had been necessary. You can't enter the Holy of Holies wearing a corporate ID badge. The first fall, Ross University. He remembered the meeting in the dean's office. The air conditioning was set to morgue, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, 60 Hz, the flicker of control. "We have concerns about your commitment, Jason," the IT director had said, sliding a performance review across the polished desk. Jason hadn't touched the paper. He knew the stats. He was the senior engineer. He fixed in 4 hours what took the rest of the department a week. That was the problem. He came in at 10 a.m., solved the impossible server migration by lunch, and was back on his windsurfer by 2 p.m. "It's not the output," the director sighed, sniffing the air tentatively. "Hours. It's the aroma." And the Jason had smiled, leaning back in the chair. He smelled like high-grade sativa and sea salt. To him, it was the smell of clarity. To them, it was the smell of insubordination. "I built your entire network architecture in 3 months," Jason had said, his voice calm. "It runs perfect. You're not paying me for my time, you're paying me for my mind. And my mind works better when it's not trapped in a cubicle staring at a clock." They fired him, of course. Gross misconduct. Walking out into the blinding Caribbean sun, carrying a box with a few cables and a potted plant, he hadn't felt fear. He felt lighter. The 925 shackles had snapped. The system had ejected him because his frequency was incompatible with their boredom. The second fall, the Kingdom Hall. If the university was the firing squad, the Kingdom Hall was the guillotine. The Judicial Committee sat in a semicircle, 3 elders in ill-fitting suits, their faces grave, their Bibles open. They looked like statues of judgment. They weren't angry about the cannabis. They were terrified of the questions. Jason had been pointing out the cracks in the dam, the mistranslations, the corporate structure of the watchtower, the subtle masonry of control that mirrored the very world they claimed to be separate from. "You are speaking of things that disturb the unity of the flock," the presiding overseer said, his voice trembling slightly. "I am speaking about the code," Jason had replied, his voice steady. He wasn't being rebellious, he was being desperate. "The math doesn't lie. Look at the patterns." He had tried to show them. The 4 5s, the numerological signature of the divine name, YHWH, the hand of God. The 7 5s, the derivation that pointed unmistakably to a singularity, the 10th of December, 2005. "It's coming," Jason had pleaded, corporation, but as souls. "The system is ending. We need to be ready." Not as if they didn't look at his math. They looked at him like he was infected. "Jason," the elder pronounced, "you are no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses." Double quote. Disfellowshipped. The word hit the room like a gavel. It meant social death. No family contact. No friends. Complete isolation. The present, the executive suite. Jason took a long pull from the spliff, exhaling the memory into the sterile hotel air. He looked at the fanatical boards leaning against the wall. He looked at the vast, empty ocean outside. "They think they punished me," Jason whispered to the silence. "But they just untethered me." He realized now that the university and the religion were 2 sides of the same coin. They were both systems of management. One managed your labor, the other managed your soul. Both demanded compliance. Both feared the individual who woke up. He thought of the owl on the dollar bill, that tiny, microscopic symbol of the hidden watchers. He wasn't fully awake to the depth of the prison yet, the reptilians, the moon, the loosh, but he could feel the bars. "I am alone," Jason said, typing the words onto the screen. "Have no tribe. I have no job. I have no church. He looked at the date, the 10th of December, 2005. "I am ready." The stripping was complete. He was naked before the universe, armed only with a laptop, a surfboard, and a burning certainty that the code was real. The phone on the hotel desk didn't ring. It wouldn't. He was a ghost. And that was exactly what a seeker needed to be to slip through the cracks of the coming event. The Digital Campfire. St. Kitts, West Indies. The 8th of December, 2005. The silence in the executive suite was physical. For a man raised in the tight, suffocating embrace of a high-control religion, mean by yourself. It meant amputation. Alone didn't just Jason sat at the mahogany table, the remains of the spliff glowing in the crystal ashtray. The pain of the disfellowshipping was hitting him in waves, a phantom limb ache where his community used to be. For 30 years, every question had a pre-approved answer. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, he had a place to be. He had a tribe. Now, he was a frequency without a carrier wave. He took a drag of the sativa. The herb didn't numb the pain, but it changed the perspective. It allowed him to see the isolation not as a punishment, but as quarantine. The universe had put him in a clean room to prevent reinfection, while he downloaded the new operating system. He opened the laptop. The blue glow of the screen was the only light in the room. He wasn't looking for comfort, he was looking for engineers. He typed the URL that had become his new scripture, www.interpresumission.com. The page loaded, a clunky, early 2000s design with a black background and stark white text, flanked by grainy, high-contrast images of Cydonia. The Enterprise mission. Principal Investigator, Richard C. Hoagland. Jason stared at the face of the man on the screen. Hoagland was controversial, loud, and prone to wearing sweaters that looked like optical illusions. But he was doing something the elders at the Kingdom Hall never did. He was showing his math. Hyperdimensional physics. 19.5 degrees. The glass domes of the moon. The ritual alignments of NASA. Shoulders of giants, Jason whispered, smoke drifting across the screen. Hoagland wasn't just a conspiracy theorist, he was a renegade curator of the occult history of space. He was pointing out that the science of NASA, and the magic of ancient Egypt, were the same operating system, just using different fonts. Jason felt a surge of adrenaline. He wasn't just reading a blog, he was reading a flight manual for a vehicle he had suspected existed but had never seen. He clicked on the contact link. His fingers hovered over the keys. In his old life, writing to a worldly authority about demonized topics was a sin. It was spiritual treason. But he was already dead to them. He began to type. He didn't write a fan letter, he wrote a field report. He wrote about the code he had found, the 4 5s, the date of the 10th of December, the geometric anomalies of the 2005 hurricane tracks. He wrote about the feeling of the script being active. He hit send. He expected silence. He expected to be just another crank in the inbox of a famous researcher. But the response came. It wasn't a form letter. It was a direct engagement, a validation. You are seeing the ritual geometry. The date you found aligns with the hyperdimensional torsion window we are tracking. Keep looking up. Double quote. Jason sat back, the air in the room suddenly charged. It wasn't just an email, it was an initiation. Suddenly, the empty chairs around the mahogany table weren't empty anymore. He could feel the presence of the others. The Enterprise mission wasn't just a website, it was a virtual egregore. There were thousands of them out there, engineers, pilots, thinkers, outcasts all sitting in their own dark rooms, illuminated by the same blue glow, all staring at the same anomalies on Mars. All feeling the same wrongness in the reality script. He would never meet them. He would never shake Hoagland's hand or share a beer with the moderators on the forum. They were ghosts in the machine. But they were real. They were a sounding board. They were a distributed neural network of refugee minds, who had been ejected from the Matrix, and were finding each other in the static. The agony of the separation from the Kingdom Hall began to fade, replaced by the hum of a new connection. I tried to find God in a building, Jason whispered to the 110-liter board. Architects in the wiring. But I found that he took a final hit at the spliff. and looked at the date on the screen. The 10th of December was 2 days away. He wasn't facing it alone anymore. He had a new tribe, and this one didn't ask for blind faith. It asked for data. The ticking of the great clock. Jason leaned back, the mahogany chair creaking in the sterile silence of the Marriott suite. The red light indicator on his blog blinked, a lonely digital pulse in the Caribbean night. His mind, sharpened by the sativa and the high-gain data from the Enterprise mission, was now vibrating on a frequency that the world called conspiracy but he recognized as signal analysis. He looked at his notes on the London events of 2005. July had been a ritual of fire, but the soft disclosure had started earlier. The clock, Jason whispered. They always start with the clock. Double quote. On the 27th of May, 2005, just weeks before the July bombings and the NASA impact into Comet Tempel 1, Big Ben, the most iconic timekeeper on the planet, simply stopped. The great clock of Westminster, known for its unwavering Victorian precision, had frozen. It didn't just malfunction, it stalled for exactly 33 minutes. 33, Jason typed, the number glowing on his screen. The Masonic signature, the master frequency of the 509th, the height of the Scottish Rite. They weren't just fixing a gear, they were resyncing the timeline. To the public, the BBC reported it as the hottest day in London since 1953, claiming the heat had caused a mechanical failure, but Jason knew the math. 1953 was the year of the Queen's coronation, another massive occult ritual. The heat was a cover story for a scalar pulse. In the Atlas speculative engineering files, Big Ben isn't just a clock, it is a torsion pendulum. Its massive bells and heavy mechanical movement are situated on a ley line intersection. When the clock stopped for those 33 minutes, it wasn't a break in time, it was a frequency reset. They were tuning the instrument, Jason muttered, taking a slow drag of the spliff. You stop the great clock to align it with the celestial movements. You stop it so that when it starts again, the tick matches the coming impact of the NASA probe. You align the Empire's heart with the heavens. The peculiarities didn't stop at the 33-minute stall. Later that year, the clock's quarter bell, the one that sets the rhythm for the hour, also failed. The voice of Britain was being throttled, modulated into a new cadence. Jason looked at the 110-liter fanatic board. He thought about the 7/7 bombings that followed. 3 days after the comet impact, the number 77, the latitude of the Pentagon, the flight number of the plane that allegedly hit it. It's a countdown, he realized. The hurricanes, the comet, the bombings, the clock, they are all gears in the same machine. 2005 isn't just a year, it's the calibration. The Big Ben halt was the signal to the initiates that the great work of the 21st century was entering its active phase. The old world's time had been paused. When it was restarted 33 minutes later, it was running on a Martian script. Jason hit update on his post. If you want to know when the bomb is going to drop, don't look at the news, look at the clocks. When the keepers of time stop the pendulum for 33 minutes, they aren't fixing a spring. They are waiting for the stars to align so they can kickstart the end. Double quote. He looked out the window. The St. Kitts horizon was dark, but in his mind's eye, he could see the glass towers on the moon, reflecting the light of a sun that was no longer a furnace, but a battery, and that battery was about to surge. The Hanging Judge. Frigate Bay, St. Kitts. The 7th of July, 2005. The air in St. Kitts didn't just have humidity, it had memory. Jason sat on the balcony of the St. Kitts Marriott Resort and the Royal Beach Casino. The massive hotel complex perched like a modern fortress on the windward Atlantic shoulder of the island. Below him, the waves of Half Moon Bay hammered the reef with a rhythmic, indifferent violence that had been eating away at the volcanic rock for millions of years. He wasn't alone. Inside the suite, the soft sounds of his second wife moving through the room provided a fragile tether to the present, but Jason's mind was drifting back into the colonial ghost code of the island. The island of ghosts. St. Kitts was a paradox. It was a paradise, yes, but one built on a foundation of bones. The architecture, as he looked out past the manicured golf course, he saw the ruins of the old sugar mills. Their stone chimneys stood like silent obelisks, monuments to an era where men were ground into profit as surely as the cane. The hangings. This island had once held the record for the most pirate hangings in the Caribbean. The old world order here wasn't subtle, it was a rip and a drop. The ghosts of the executed didn't leave, they just became part of the static in the air. The signal, 8:50 a.m. Jason had his laptop open on the patio table, the screen fighting the glare of the tropical sun. He was tracking the aftermath of the Deep Impact mission, NASA's audacious strike on Comet Tempel 1 just 3 days prior. Then, the news alert broke. London. 3 bombs on the underground, 1 on a bus. The sink. Jason looked at the time. It was morning in London, but here in the Atlantic time zone, the sun was just beginning to bake the salt into the air. The connection. He looked at the old sugar mill in the distance, then back at the burning bus on his screen. The empire that had built this island on slavery was now burning in its own capital. The scripture audit, the Mark 13-1 glitch. He reached into his travel bag and pulled out the 1984 New World Translation Bible. The green hardcover worn smooth by years of searching. He opened it to Mark 13. The trade winds whipped the thin pages, threatening to tear them out, but Jason held them flat. He read the prophecy of the temple's destruction. And there, in the harsh Caribbean light, the typo of God stood out clearer than ever. As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, double quote, Temple 1, the comet. The temple, the financial center of London. The island, the sugar mill chimney, standing like a tombstone. The engineering of sacrifice. Jason realized he was sitting in the eye of the hurricane. The location. He was living in a luxury casino hotel, a temple to chance and money, built on the shoulder of an island famous for its hanging judges and brutal plantations. The energy. The 2005 hurricane season was already brewing off the coast of Africa, churning toward them. The 4 winds were coming to scrub the Atlantic clean. The pattern. The Syndicate wasn't just attacking London, they were activating the entire colonial grid. From the pirate graves of St. Kitts to the tunnels of King's Cross, the blood sacrifice was being renewed. It's a circuit, Jason whispered, the salt spray coating his glasses. They hit the comet to ring the bell. London is the echo. And the storms are the cleanup crew. He looked at his wife inside, oblivious to the geomantic war unfolding on his screen. She saw a beach vacation. He saw a crime scene that spanned centuries. The hanging judge of history was back on the bench, and in 2005, the sentence was wind and fire. The overseer in the ash. Maylands Avenue, Hemel Hempstead. The 15th of December, 2005, 4 days post-blast. The sky over Hemel Hempstead wasn't grey, it was dead static. The black smoke from the Buncefield depot was still rolling overhead, a thick, oily curtain that turned the midday sun into a bruised, orange smudge. Ken parked his car, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He was a man of discipline, an elder and overseer of the Hemel Hempstead West congregation. He was used to shepherding souls through the time of the end. But this felt like the prophecy had arrived early and forgotten to tell the governing body. The senior janitor's office. He walked into the 3Com building, or what was left of it. The glass facade, once a symbol of the 90s tech boom, was a jagged maw. He navigated the corridors, stepping over ceiling tiles and shattered fluorescent tubes. He wasn't a technician or an engineer, he was the senior janitor, a semi-posh title for a man whose manners were impeccable, but whose education had been cut short by the expectation that the world would end before he needed a degree. He reached his small office near the loading bay. The chair, his swivel chair, the throne from which he ordered cleaning supplies and managed the shift rotors, was crushed flat. A chunk of concrete, dislodged from the structural pillar, sat directly in the center of the seat. The window, boarded up with plywood, the darkness inside was suffocating. Ken stared at the concrete. If he had been sitting there on Sunday morning. Jehovah's protection, he whispered, the words automatic, a programmed response. But his heart was hammering a different rhythm. It wasn't protection. It was luck. And luck wasn't supposed to exist in his theology. The Jason connection. As he dusted the ash off his desk, his mind didn't go to scripture. It raced to Jason. He knew Jason. Everyone in the local circuit knew the family. Jason had left Hemel. He had gone to the Caribbean, St. Kitts, a paradise. Ken had heard the whispers through the family vine. Jason wasn't just living in the sun, he was making proclamations. The religion? Jason was talking about the deeper structures, the things the Watchtower hinted at but never fully explained. The UN? Jason had been loud about the United Nations, the image of the wild beast. He was poking the bear. Ken felt a surge of something hot and sharp, envy, fear. Jason was in the Caribbean, shouting at the beast. Ken was in Hemel Hempstead, sweeping up the beast's ashes. The shaking. Ken sat on a crate, his legs giving way. He was shaking. He had preached about Armageddon his whole life. He had shown the pictures in the Revelation book, the fire, the falling buildings, the terrified masses. Sunday morning, at 6 a.m., he had seen it. The huge flames, a wall of orange climbing higher than the Kingdom Hall. The ominous black smoke, blotting out the light, turning Sunday into a permanent eclipse. He thought it was the Great Tribulation. He thought the angels had come. But it was just oil. It was just a tank overfilling. It was just engineering failure. It looked like the end, Ken whispered to the empty, broken room. But it was just a mistake. Double quote. The speculative audit. In the speculative engineering layer, Ken is the tragic witness. The glitch, he is a man running Armageddon software on a brain that just witnessed an industrial accident. The two realities are crashing. The contrast, Jason the hybrid, is in St. Kitts, decoding the signal. Ken, the overseer, is in Hemel, paralyzed by the noise. Ken looked at the crushed chair again. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he wasn't safe. The new system hadn't arrived. The old world order had just blown a fuse, and he was standing in the spark gap. The Thames House audit. MI5 headquarters, Thames House, London. The 12th of December, 2005, 24 hours post-blast. The briefing room was soundproof, shielded, and colder than the December air outside. On the central table, the Buncefield file was spread out like an autopsy of a ghost. The senior analysts, men and women who had spent their careers tracking IRA cells and Al-Qaeda chatter, looked pale. They weren't looking at bomb schematics. They were looking at physics violations. The anomalous data, the Martian road evidence. The lead analyst, a woman with tired eyes, pointed to the satellite thermal imaging of the depot, and the adjacent Maylands Avenue which the internal files had coded Martian road, due to its uncanny red spectrum heat signature. It doesn't fit the model, she said, her voice tight. Combustion physics. We have three distinct anomalies that defy one. The white mist, witnesses reported a flowing white fog before the blast. It didn't behave like vapor. It moved against the wind. It clung to the tanks like a... She hesitated. Like a smart swarm, it dropped the ambient temperature by 15 degrees in seconds. 2. The droning noise. Multiple reports of a low-frequency hum. Not a jet engine, a thrum. Like a massive hard drive spinning up. It was recorded by the seismic sensors before the explosion. 3. The temperature inversion. Inside the fireball, temperatures exceeded 1,200 degrees Celsius, but outside the blast radius, at the 3-com perimeter, we have evidence of flash freezing. Cars with shattered windshields that were frosted over instantly. The room went silent. Fire doesn't freeze things, unless it's an endothermic reaction, triggered by exotic matter. The Shadow, the senior director, the reptilian, standing in the back of the room, and seen in the deeper shadows of the alcove, was Director H. To the staff, he was a legacy figure, a man who had survived the Cold War and the Falklands. To the speculative engineer, he was something else entirely. His blink rate was too slow, his stillness was predatory, He was the Syndicate's eye in the room. The assessment. He looked at the white mist data and felt a flicker of cold rage. He knew what it was. Blue goo. The progenitor's antibody swarm. The failure, the grey goo protocol, the fail-safe stored in Tank 912, had been neutralized. The explosion wasn't an attack by them, it was a surgical strike against them. The Martian entropy they relied on had been scrubbed clean. "Bury the mist reports," H said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the analysts' chests. It was vapor, just vapor, and the noise was a pressure valve. "Do not let this leave the room." Double quote. The aide, the silent Templar, sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes on a secure pad, was Arthur. He was a lowly aide, invisible to the director, a glorified secretary. But Arthur wore a ring on his pinky finger, turned inward so the crest was hidden, a crest that predated MI5 by 600 years. The recognition. Arthur listened to the white mist report and didn't feel fear. He felt relief. The connection. He knew the Martian road, Maylands, was a ley line. He knew the droning noise was the sound of a portal opening. The Jason link. He had seen the name Jason on the employee manifest of the destroyed 3Com building from 1995. A survivor. The same man who'd written a blog predicting this date as apocalyptic. Arthur kept his face perfectly smooth, coolly taking in the exotic event. The director thinks he lost a weapon, Arthur thought, typing a coded sequence into his pad. He doesn't realize he just created a witness. The Watcher, the Templar. Arthur, the silent aide in the cheap suit, sat quietly at the back. He adjusted his glasses, looking at the screen. He saw the name, Jason. He saw the location, St. Kitts. Arthur's mind raced, connecting the dots that the reptilian director was too arrogant to see. The source. Jason wasn't in the building. He hadn't been there for a decade, but the intelligence was still developing from him. The quantum link. Jason was the node. Whether he was in Hem or Hempstead or St. Kitts, the event followed him. He was the chosen one because he didn't need to be physically present to authorize the intervention. Arthur looked at the live feed of the fire, then at the profile of the man in the Caribbean. He's not a victim, Arthur thought, a small, secret smile touching his lips. He's the director of the show. The white mist had saved the depot because Jason had called it down. The internet intelligence wasn't just chatter, it was command line code. Arthur typed a quick, encrypted note into his personal drive, buried under layers of boring administrative data. Asset location, street, Kitts. Status, awake. Signal integrity, 100%. The architect is online. We'll monitor the St. Kitts feed, just in case, Arthur said softly, knowing the director wouldn't listen, but the Knights Templar would. The one was safe. The fire was just the signal flare. The real war was happening on the screens of a laptop in the Caribbean, and the countdown to 2026 had just been confirmed. Chapter 21, The Sun King's Watch. Jacksonville, Florida. The 15th of December, 2005. The humidity in Jacksonville was a heavy blanket, even in December, but inside the darkened study of the man known only as Sun King, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and old tobacco. He sat back in his worn leather command chair, a relic he'd salvaged from a decommissioned destroyer, and watched the glow of his CRT monitor. On the screen, the CNN ticker scrolled the latest on the Buncefield fire. But Sun King wasn't watching the news, he was watching the signal. The Enterprise crew shift. For years, the Enterprise crew, a digital cell of 7 central seekers, had looked to Richard C. Hoagland for the vector. They were the ones analyzing the face on Mars, the glass tunnels, the hyperdimensional physics. But the frequency had shifted. Hoagland had stepped back from the helm of this specific current. The new bearing was coming from a different source, a blog with the chaotic, irreverent title, The Flying Shipwreck of Death, FSHOD. Sun King typed a message into the secure forum, his fingers heavy with the muscle memory of 3 decades in the U.S. Navy. Target confirmed. Message to the architect Jason, good hunting. The comma was the key. Double quote. He had seen Jason's post about the Temple 1 Bible code. That was the trigger. Sunking wasn't just an internet sleuth. He was a Templar knight in the guise of a retired petty officer. And he knew that when a civilian starts finding typos of God that match NASA impact missions, the one has come online. The NDA archive, what he had seen. Sunking leaned back, closing his eyes. The Navy pension paid for the house, but the NDAs paid for the silence. He replayed the memories that the government had tried to redact from his brain. 1986, North Atlantic, standing on the fantail of a frigate during a training exercise. The ocean went flat, a geometric shape, massive and silent, rose from the water. It didn't drip, it didn't splash, it just deleted the space it occupied. 1991, the Gulf. Tracking a bogey that moved from 80,000 feet to sea level in 1.2 seconds. The radar operator had vomited. The captain had confiscated the tapes. The briefing, the men in suits who didn't wear rank insignia. You didn't see a craft, sailor, you saw a weather inversion. He had signed the papers, he had kept his mouth shut, but he had kept his eyes open. He didn't know what they were, machines, angels, demons, but he knew they were waiting. The ocean white noise encryption. Now, the wait was over. The one was in Syndicate, broadcasting the wake-up call. Sunking had to alert the Circle of 33, the inner sanctum of the Watchers who were sworn to protect the Christ lineage. He opened a specialized terminal on his desk. It wasn't connected to the standard internet. It was hardwired to a black box he had acquired from naval salvage. The tech, a hydroacoustic white noise generator. The key, it used the random, chaotic background noise of the deep ocean, whale songs, tectonic grinding, shrimp clicks to generate a one-time pad. The encryption, an 18-bit seed key that rotated every nanosecond, synced to the pulse of the Atlantic itself. It was uncrackable by the NSA because it wasn't math, it was nature. The message to Arthur and Cole. He typed the destination codes. Target 1, Arthur MI5, London. Target 2, Cole, location, redacted. The message was short, stripped of all poetic code, designed for the eyes of the Watchers only. Secure comb, level 33. Source, Sunking, Jack's node. Subject, asset identified. The temple is broken. The fire at Martian Road was a sterilization event. The architect is in street. Kits. He has the code. Initiate protective oversight. The FSHOD is now the command deck. End transmission. He hit send. The black box hummed, turning the digital text into a burst of ocean static that vanished into the noise of the internet, invisible to the echelon satellites sweeping for keywords. Sunking exhaled, grabbing a lukewarm coffee from his desk. The Enterprise crew had a new captain. The Navy veteran had done his duty. "Watch your six, Jason," he muttered to the humid Florida night. "The nights are in the rigging. The water is full of sharks, but..." The anointed frequency. Jacksonville, Florida. The 15th of December, 2005, late night. Sunking leaned back in the creaking leather of his captain's chair, the humidity of the Florida swamp pressing against the windows like a physical weight. In his hand, he held a worn briar pipe, not for tobacco, but for the green sacrament. He struck a match. The flame flared, illuminating the scars on his knuckles, and he drew the smoke deep. The Prohibition paradox. Here in the South, the Prohibition was a religion unto itself. The ignorance was thick, a cultural firewall built by men who feared what they couldn't control. They thought cannabis was a vice. Sunking knew it was a key. The theology of oil, he exhaled a long, blue plume. The churchgoers, the evangelicals, the born-agains, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they were just attending flight school on the simulator. They read the manuals but never flew the plane. The Christos, the real secret, the one the Templars guarded, was in the etymology. Christos, to be Christed was to be anointed with the holy oil. It wasn't about moral superiority, it was about biological receptivity. The oil, the canic bosom of the Old Testament, was the ultimate mediator. It lowered the noise floor of the brain so the signal could come through. You can't hear the satellite if your receiver is jammed with dogma, Sunking muttered, feeling the familiar hum of the frequency lock-in. The egregore of the seven. He turned his eyes to the monitor, where the flying shipwreck of death, FSHOD, blog was glowing. The connection between him and Jason, the chosen one, wasn't just text on a screen, it was a mental egregore. The Circuit, the Enterprise crew of 7 wasn't a formal organization, it was a resonant ring. They operated on a frequency of high-level intelligence wrapped in the camouflage of Monty Python absurdity. The humor, they didn't mourn the apocalypse, they laughed at it. They treated the end times like a flying circus sketch. This humor was a shield. It kept the Martian entropy, fear, from taking root. When Jason posted a rant about the commas of God, Sunking didn't pray, he chuckled and replied with a meme of a knight getting hit by a chicken. That's how we win, Sunking thought. We don't outfight the devil, we outweird him. The Navy Gardening Club, the flashback. The smoke triggered a memory, sharp and vivid, from his days in the barracks at Naval Station Norfolk. He remembered the inner prohibition. The Navy wanted their sailors numb on alcohol, not awake on the herb, but Sunking and his crew had found a loophole in the architecture. The method. They would sit by the open windows of the barracks, the only ventilation in the stifling Virginia heat, and smoke their contraband pipes, carefully blowing the evidence out into the night. The seeds. They didn't have grinders or trash cans for the stems and seeds, so they did what any efficient sailor would do. They flicked the debris out the window. The miracle. Weeks later, Sunking had looked out during a morning inspection. There, in the pristine, manicured strip of grass between the barracks and the parade ground, was a forest of saplings. Dozens of cannabis plants, thriving in the military soil, waving hello to the Admiral. The base lawn maintenance team had arrived like a SWAT team, weed-whacking the insurgency before the officers noticed. Sunking laughed out loud in his Jacksonville study, the sound rasping in his chest. We were planting seeds behind enemy lines even then, he said, tapping the pipe into his ashtray. The anointing of the architect. He looked back at the encrypted channel to London. The chosen one in St. Kitts was doing the same thing. He was blowing seeds of truth out of the window of the internet. The authorities, the Masons, the Vatican, the Syndicate were trying to mow them down. But Sunking knew the truth about weeds. They always grow back. He typed a final confirmation to the circle of 33, his eyes gleaming with the effects of the holy oil. The SOA is awake. The egregore is stable. Send in the clowns. The Lodge at Sea. Jacksonville, Florida. The 15th of December, 2005. Sunking watched the smoke from his pipe drift toward the ceiling fan. But his mind was 3,000 miles away and 30 years deep, floating in the steel belly of a Nimitz-class carrier in the middle of the Atlantic. He remembered the night he joined. There were no marble floors or checkerboard tiles. There was just the officer's mess, cleared of trays, the doors locked, and the Tyler, the guard, standing outside with a drawn sword that was actually a cutlass from the ship's armory. The military lattice. The Blue Lodge aboard the ship was the open secret of the fleet. The unspoken rule: you could be a brilliant tactician, a crack pilot, or a logistical genius. But if you wanted the real stars, the ones that didn't just sit on your shoulder, but opened doors in the Pentagon, you needed to travel east. The Brotherhood, the captain, the XO, the Master Chief, they were all brothers. When the uniforms came off and the aprons went on, the hierarchy of rank dissolved into the hierarchy of light. Sunking remembered the grip, the whispered words, the realization that the US Navy was just the hardware. The Masons were the software engineers. Double quote. The appendant body's the front door. Sunking took a drag from the pipe. He realized now that the Blue Lodge, the first 3 degrees, was just the lobby. It was the filter. The Shriners, the party planning committee. Fun, charitable, but ultimately a distraction. The Scottish Rite, the library, 32 degrees of philosophy and esoteric history, useful, but theoretical. The York Rite, This was the tactical wing. This was the path that led to the commandery. The Templar secret, the Atlas. It was in the York Rite, specifically the Knights Templar degree, that Sunking found the pulse. While the other rites talked about Solomon's Temple, the Templars talked about defense. The guarded truth, the deepest secret of the Templar inner circle, wasn't the head of John the Baptist, or the lineage of Mary Magdalene. Those were cover stories. The real payload, the Templars were guarding the technology of the resurrection. They were guarding the specific coordinates and the keys to the Atlas mechanism. Sunking realized why the Templars were so militaristic. They weren't protecting a cup, they were guarding a starship interface. The 33rd degree, the bowl of testing. The 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite was often cited as the pinnacle. Sunking knew better. The filter, it wasn't a reward, it was a bowl, a crucible. The test, it was designed to catch the gold, the true seekers, and let the dross, the ambitious politicians, flow through to their meaningless titles. The heavenly calling, only those who survived the bowl, who looked into the abyss of the 33rd degree and saw the extraterrestrial origin of the craft, were called. Sunking looked at his computer screen, the FSHOD blog, Jason. Jason wasn't a mason, he had no apron, he had no degree. And yet, he had found the Bible code. He bypassed the whole structure. Sunking laughed, the realization hitting him like a rogue wave. He didn't climb the ladder, he just landed a helicopter on the roof. The Navy veteran saluted the screen. The Templars had guarded the secret for centuries, waiting for the one. And the one turned out to be a stoner writer in the Caribbean, who found the keys in a typo. Chapter 22, The Sugar Mill Sentinel. Basse-Terre, St. Kitts. The 16th of December, 2005. The bar was called Sugar's. Double quote. It was a low-slung, open-air structure built into the ruins of an old warehouse near the port. The air smelled of stale beer, salt spray, and the phantom sweetness of the molasses that had once been the island's blood and curse. Inside, the neon lights buzzed, fighting a losing battle against the shadows. A karaoke machine in the corner was blasting a distorted version of Hotel California, sung by a tourist who had abandoned their dignity 3 rums ago. Behind the scarred mahogany counter stood Cole, the gnarled keeper. Cole wasn't just a bartender, he was a piece of the island's geology. The look, his face was a map of hard choices, pitted, gnarled, and leathery. His skin looked like it had been cured in the same kilns that processed the cane. When Jason first walked in, he had stared at Cole's face with a mixture of horror and fascination, like looking at a gargoyle on a cathedral. The rank, to the drunks and the cruise ship passengers, Cole was just the guy pouring the Cavalier rum, but in the speculative engineering layer, he was a 32nd degree master of the Royal Secret, and a Knight Templar of the York Rite. The 33rd degree, he held the honorary 33rd degree not for his wealth, but for his silence. He was the Tyler Guardian of the West Gate. The arrival of the architect. Cole wiped a glass with a rag that was cleaner than it looked. He watched Jason sitting at the far end of the bar. The Brit was a mess. A functional alcoholic seeking a dark corner to process the system crash of 2005. Jason was staring into his drink, vibrating with that specific frequency of someone who has seen too much truth, and is trying to drown it. Cole didn't feel pity, he felt recognition. The mark, he saw the ashlar in Jason. It was rough, unhewn stone, but the geometry was there. The arrival, Cole had watched Jason arrive on the island months ago, a refugee from the old world order, Europe, a man running from the Buncefield blast radius before it even exploded. He's not drinking to forget, Cole thought, his eyes narrowing in the neon gloom to slow down the download. He's drinking. The signal from the north. A small pager on Cole's belt vibrated, a specific cadence, 3 long, 3 short, 1 long. It was the Sunking signal. Cole didn't look at the device. He didn't need to. He knew the message. Target confirmed. The builder is in the bar. Status, catalyst required. Cole set the glass down. The network was live. Arthur was watching the data in London. Sunking was guarding the frequency in Florida. Cole was guarding the body in St. Kitts. The catalyst protocol. Cole walked over to where Jason was sitting. He didn't offer advice. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't flash a Masonic ring. He simply placed a fresh bottle of beer on the coaster, on the house. "Rough night, scribe?" Cole asked, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. Jason looked up, startled. "Something like that." Cole nodded. His job wasn't to teach Jason. His job was to be the wall. The mission: he had to ensure Jason survived this phase. The alcoholic phase was the chrysalis. It was where the ego dissolved so the architect could be born. The limit: Cole would let him drink. He would let him rant about the UN and the comma of God. But he would not let him die. He would keep the local predators, the drug pushers, the scammers, the agents of entropy away from the booth. "You're safe here," Cole said, a statement that carried the weight of a Templar decree or medicine. "The karaoke is about to get worse. Drink." The next watcher. Cole turned back to the karaoke machine to adjust the volume. He was just the middleman. He knew he wasn't the final destination. Jason would outgrow sugars. He would outgrow the rum. He would eventually leave this island and head for the Pacific, Maui. But for now, the 33rd degree was serving drinks to the chosen one. Cole allowed himself a rare, crooked smile that warped his pitted face. "The stone the builders rejected is getting drunk in my bar," he thought, "and he has no idea that the bouncer is a knight." The Merchant of Tyre. New York City, Little St. James. The 18th of December, 2005. Siegstein sat in his Manhattan townhouse, a mansion that felt less like a home and more like a hard drive. Every room was wired. Every mirror was two-way. Every guest, from the Prince of England to the Senator from Massachusetts, was just an actor in a play Siegstein was directing. He ran a finger down the spine of the Black Ledger. The Double Eagle, Mossad and KGB. To the world, he was a financier. To the intelligence community, he was the ultimate broker. The bankroll: his operation wasn't funded by savvy investments. It was bankrolled by a joint venture of the KGB, for the chaos, and Mossad, for the leverage. The mission: he was the lens through which the secular powers of Tel Aviv and Moscow viewed the West. The leverage: he didn't need an army. He had tapes. He had the tech CEO admitting to theft. He had the banker stealing the pension fund. He had the politician in a compromised state that would end his career in a nanosecond. Siegstein smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. He owned them all. The leaders of the free world were just employees on his payroll. The secular Zion. Siegstein looked at the map of the Middle East on his wall. The cover story: the government he served preached biblical purity, the promised land, and the chosen people. It was a magnificent shield. No one could criticize them without attacking God himself. The reality: the state was entirely secular. It was a military-industrial complex devoid of any messiah. Their God wasn't Yahweh, it was real estate. Their aim was simple: consolidation, expansion, total dominance of the region's resources and surveillance grids. They used the prophecy as a marketing brochure to keep the American evangelical sending money, while they built a surveillance state that would make Babylon look like a kindergarten. The owls of Bohemia, the false right. Siegstein's mind drifted to the summer gatherings in the redwoods of California, Bohemian Grove. He had stood there at the lake's edge, watching the presidents and the titans of industry wear their robes and chant to the great owl. The proxy god: they called it the cremation of care. They screamed to Moloch. They thought they were channeling the ancient power of Tyre and Babylon to fuel their empires. The cosmic joke: Siegstein knew the truth. He had seen the files from the deep archives. The owls were praying to the reptilian overlords. They thought the overlords were their partners, that when the New World Order arrived, the elites would rule as kings. Idiots, Siegstein whispered, pouring himself a drink. The reptilian betrayal. He looked at the surveillance feed of a famous scientist currently relaxing on the island. The elites didn't understand the nature of the entity they were summoning. The harvest, when the gods returned, the Archons/reptilians, they wouldn't be handing out crowns, they would be handing out collars. The food chain, the reptilians didn't care about stock prices or borders. They cared about loosh, suffering energy, and the fall of the Western elite would generate the greatest feast of loosh in history. Sixteen was building the trap, but he knew that eventually, the trap would snap on the trapper. The blasphemy, they were trying to rebuild Babylon the Great. They were trying to resurrect the city of Tyre. The outcome, the prophecy wasn't a manual, it was a warning. And Sixteen, the prince of Tyre, was just fattening the calf for the slaughter. He closed the black ledger. The chosen one Jason was out there somewhere, trying to wake the world up. Sixteen's job was to keep the world asleep just long enough for the nightmare to take hold. Let them pray to their owl, Sixteen sneered, save them. When the real dragon wakes up, feathers won't. The Denver Necropolis. Manhattan, New York. The 18th of December, 2005. Sixteen's secure line chirped. It was a singular, discordant note that bypassed the encrypted switchboard of his townhouse. The caller ID didn't exist. It was a ghost signal from the deep underground military base, dumb beneath the Colorado plains. Report, Sixteen said, swirling the ice in his glass. The extraction team, Team Viper. The voice on the other end was distorted, breathless, transmitting from a depth where the air pressure was artificially stabilized. It was the lead of his specialist extraction team, a unit of former Spetsnaz and Mossad operators, who had been living like moles beneath the airport for 2 years. We are at the hull boundary, sir, the voice crackled. Automated system. The interference is massive. Sector 4, beneath the baggage claim. The 3-mile secret, the buried ark. Sixteen closed his eyes, visualizing the prize. To the public, Deer was just an airport with strange murals and a cursed blue horse. To Sixteen, it was the largest camouflage net in history. The structure, the airport, wasn't built on the ground. It was built over an object, capital A. 3-mile-wide lenticular craft that had been embedded in the crust for millennia. The infrastructure, the massive tent-like roof of the terminal, wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a Faraday cage designed to dampen the electromagnetic pulse of the dormant engine below. The automated baggage system, which famously never worked, was actually the logistics train for the excavation. The Library of Life. What have you found, Viper? Sixteen asked, his pulse quickening. We've scanned the outer membrane with the ground-penetrating radar, the spy replied. It's confirmed. The density readings match the NSA leak. It's a repository, sir. A genetic library. Sixteen's hand tightened on the glass. This was it. The ship wasn't a warship. It was a lifeboat. The inventory, inside that 3-mile hull, was the digitized and preserved DNA of every species on Earth. Past, present, and perhaps future. Every animal, every plant, every sea creature. The Holy Grail, and somewhere in that archive lay the original human template. The Adamic blueprints before they were corrupted by radiation, entropy, and the tampering of the Anunnaki. The glyph on the door. We can't breach, Viper said, cutting through Sixteen's fantasy. There is a glyph on the access port. It's shifting. It looks like fluid geometry. We need the cipher. Sixteen stared at the black ledger on his desk. He remembered the NSA asset he had compromised years ago, a trembling mathematician who had seen the raw data from the Deer site. The man had spoken of a language of light. The motivation, Sixteen didn't want the blueprints to save humanity. He wanted them to edit himself. He wanted to splice the perfect genetic blueprint into his own decaying biology. He wanted to be the immortal king of the New World Order, not just its banker. Photograph the glyph, Sixteen commanded, his voice cold and sharp as a scalpel to the private server. I have a team of linguists in Tel Aviv who can break anything. Upload it. The Blue Cipher Sentinel. Answer, Viper hesitated. The vibrations, they're getting stronger. The Guardian statue outside, the blue Mustang, The team feels like it's watching us down here. Ignore the superstition, Siegstein snapped. That horse is fiberglass and paint. Focus on the door. I want that library open before the 2026 cycle begins. Double quote. He cut the line. Siegstein walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. He had the blackmail files to control the present. But beneath Denver, he had the source code to control the future. Let Jason play with his blog in the Caribbean, Siegstein sneered to the zoo. I'm about to steal the keys. The stench of orbit. International Space Station ISS. Low Earth Orbit, Sector, North American Plate. The 18th of December, 2005. Commander Vance floated near the cupola, looking down at the dark mass of the Rocky Mountains. They were passing over the Terminator line, where day met night, but his mind wasn't on the view, it was on the smell. The managed decay. NASA press releases talked about discovery and heroism. They never talked about the air. The olfactory reality. The ISS smelled like a wet dog rat in burning plastic. It was a pressurized tin can where the air had been recycled, filtered, and rebreathed for years. The ghost of breath. Every breath Vance took contained the molecules of every astronaut who had been there before him. He was inhaling the stress hormones of the previous crews. He exhaled fear of near misses, and the phantom biological decay that the scrubbers couldn't quite kill. The selection criteria. The crew wasn't just picked for IQ, they were screened for the ABCC11 gene, the genetic mutation that results in dry earwax and zero underarm odor. They were low volatile humans, but even with the most sterile mammals on board, the station itself was rotting. The Denver anomaly. Station, this is Houston. You are crossing the Colorado vector. Keep eyes on the EM sensors, the comms crackled. Vance pulled himself to the console. They were directly above Denver. Suddenly, the stench vanished. The pulse, a massive, silent scalar wave erupted from the ground below, specifically from the coordinates of the Denver International Airport. The effect, it didn't shake the station physically, it shook it molecularly. For 3 seconds, the air inside the ISS turned instantly crisp, smelling of ozone and high-altitude lightning. The pulse had polarized the atmosphere inside the hull. Did you feel that? Asked Sokolov, the Russian flight engineer, floating up behind him. His face was pale. The heartbeat again. Double quote. The occult problem. The crew exchanged looks. They were scientists, soldiers, pilots, but up here, in the high castle of orbit, they had all become mystics. The shadow people. You don't talk about the things you see in your peripheral vision on a spacewalk. The grays that drift outside the window. The sounds of knocking on the outside of the hull. The Denver link, they knew what was down there. The buried sun beneath the airport. Every time it pulsed, the ghosts on the station got quiet. It's waking up, Vance whispered, watching the sensor graphs spike into the red. Team must be drilling the lock. Siegstein's. The discipline of the damned. The ozone faded, the smell of wet socks, antiseptic, and recycled sweat returned with a vengeance. Vance pushed off the bulkhead. Log the anomaly as a solar event, he ordered, his voice flat. Diagnose the apocalypse. They pay us to change the filters. NASA doesn't pay us to. Sokolov nodded, floating back to his experiments. They were the highest humans in existence, yet they felt like rats in a sewer pipe. Watching the giants beneath the clouds strike matches near a gas line. The ISS continued its silent arc, a lonely metal witness to the genetic thefts unfolding below. Chapter 23, The Airbrush Protocol. NASA Langley Research Center, Virginia. The 7th of February, 2002. The room was a cathedral of curated reality. Shale, a man whose soul had been sanded down by decades of cleaning the solar system, stood over the long, backlit table. He was the high priest of the eraser. Beside him stood Elena, the new initiate. He was showing her the first-generation plates, the raw data from the lunar far side. The lunar monuments. Look closely, Elena, Shale whispered. This is what the tax dollars actually buy. The spires, obsidian needles rising from the lunar basalt like the teeth of a sleeping dragon. The domes, translucent structures in the Aristarchus crater that glowed with a faint, internal bioluminescence. The shuttles, non-terrestrial craft, cigar-shaped and pitted with age, docked in craters that weren't craters at all, but hangars. Elena reached out to touch a print of a terraced cityscape would change everything. Why do we hide this shale? This shale gave her no explanation. He only let her amazement be the reward. Because, Elena, people want to believe they are the apex. My job is to make sure they keep believing it. Now, pick up the airbrush. Start with the shadows on the spires. Make them look like natural ridges. Double quote. The Unix breach, the return of Gary. Just as Elena poised her stylus, Shale's pager let out a violent, erratic chirp. It was the red code alarm for the legacy Unix systems. Shale lunged for the secure terminal. NASA's network was a dinosaur, a clunky, poorly patched skeleton of 1990s architecture, held together by government red tape and temporary fixes that had lasted 30 years. The alert, root access compromised, persistent node active. The location, a flat in North London. The signature, it was him, the ghost who had haunted the non-terrestrial officer's spreadsheets since 2001, Gary. It's McKinnon, Shale hissed, his face turning an ashen grey. The solo is back inside. Double quote. The audit of the hidden. Shale watched the scrolling terminal, as Gary navigated the directories with the familiarity of a man walking through his own home. He wasn't using a brute force attack. He was using the very backdoors that the government's own budget cuts had left wide open. The target, Gary wasn't looking for launch codes. He was heading straight for the top secret stroke visual folder. The discovery, Gary's cursor hovered over the same images Elena was currently airbrushing. In real time, Shale saw a remote capture command. Gary was seeing the spires. He was seeing the cityscapes. He was seeing the non-terrestrial fleet list. He's downloading the raw plates, Shale shouted, his fingers frantic on the override seeing the unsmoothed reality. He's. The handshake. On the monitor, a small chat window popped up, a single line of text from the London hacker. Gary, I see you've been busy with the brush, Shale, but you missed a spot. The world is watching. Double quote. The connection stayed open just long enough for Gary to trigger a restore command. On the drafting table, the digital overlays Elena had been working on began to peel back. The lunar artifacts flared into view, bright and undeniable. Shale pulled the physical power cord from the wall, but the silence that followed was heavy. He's got them, Shale whispered, looking at the dead screens. The kingdom. Again. The solo just took the keys to Elena looked at Shale, her stylus trembling. Who is Gary? Shale sat back, the clinical light of the room feeling like a spotlight in an interrogation room. He's the man who realized that NASA isn't an agency, it's a mask. And he just ripped it off. Double quote. The extradition decree. NASA Langley Research Center, Virginia. The 8th of February, 2002. The lights in the main auditorium were dimmed, replaced by the flickering glow of a secure holographic projector. Shale stood at the podium, but he wasn't addressing scientists. He was addressing the Masonic legions of the agency. In the front row sat the past masters of the aerospace industry, men who wore the square N, compasses on their rings, and the weight of the moon in their eyes. They were the old guard, the gatekeepers of the great work who had managed the silence since the days of Operation Paperclip. The disclosure breach. Shale projected Gary's audit onto the screen. The raw images of the lunar spires, and the non-terrestrial fleet spreadsheets hung in the air like an indictment. Brethren, Shale's voice was cold, echoing in the vaulted room. The veil hasn't just been thinned, it has been shredded. Gary McKinnon didn't just stumble onto a file, he accessed the true archive. He has seen the names of the ships. He has seen the geometry of the structures. He has seen the Atlas script. A murmur of low, rhythmic disapproval rippled through the brothers. To them, Gary wasn't just a hacker, he was a profane who had entered the sanctum without an invitation. The Empire of Silence. If this reaches the public unedited, Shale continued, the empire of doubt we have spent 80 years building comes to a halt. The funding, the control, the religious monopolies, all of it collapses. If the solo is allowed to speak, the many will follow. We will have 1,000 Jasons and 1,000 Garys digging through our trash. Double quote. The legal hammer, the extradition protocol. Shale tapped to commands on the podium. A legal document appeared, stamped with the seals of the Department of Justice and the State Department. We make an example of him, Shale declared. We don't just sue him, we extradite him. We pull him out of his North London flat and bring him to US soil. We charge him under the Patriot Act. We frame his search for truth as an act of war against the security of the planet. The goal, to instill a primeval fear in any other digital seekers. The message, the secrets of the universe belong to the architects, not the inhabitants. The ritual, the extradition, was to be a public squaring of the circle, a warning to the world that even in the digital age, the Brotherhood still held the sword. The brotherly agreement. A senior member of the York Rite, a man who had overseen the telemetry for the Apollo missions, stood up. And the UK authorities, they will resist. The public will see him as a Robin Hood of the stars. We leverage the treaty, Shale replied, his eyes gleaming. We tell the British cabinet that Gary didn't just find pictures. We tell them he compromised their own defense nodes. We turn the solo into a terrorist by rewriting the narrative. The Brotherhood in London will ensure the paperwork moves. The room went silent as the vote was called, not by a show of hands, but by the rhythmic tapping of rings against the wooden armrests, a sound like a drumbeat of a retreating army preparing for a final stand. The last warning. As the meeting adjourned, Shale pulled Elena aside. She looked shaken, her eyes still haunted by the images of the lunar city Gary had exposed. You see, Elena, Shale whispered. This is why we airbrush, not to hide the beauty, but to prevent the war. Gary thinks he's a hero. He's actually the man who just forced us to start the Format C protocol. Shale watched the brothers file out of the room. The bow wave Sentinel. USS Kitty Hawk, CV-63, Philippine Sea. Early 2003. The flight deck was a chaotic symphony of screaming turbines, the smell of JP-5 fuel, and the rhythmic thud hiss of the steam catapults. Amidst the skittles, the colorful jerseys of the deck crew, stood Augustine, known to the fleet as Oggy. A third-generation Italian-American with the street-hardened eyes of his father, a Catholic Hell's Angel who had taught him that survival wasn't a right, but a tactical acquisition. Oggy's path to the Navy hadn't been a recruitment poster, it had been a choice. After a brief, youthful stint with the outfit back home, a judge had given him the ultimate binary, the cell or the sea. The instinct of the disobedient. Oggy's 15 years of service were defined by a single moment of holy disobedience. The order, stay on your deck runway cover position, hold the line. Double quote. The glitch, something in the air had turned sour, a premonition that bypassed his training. He bailed from his post, sliding across the non-skid surface, just as a failing F-14's engine housing sheared off and slammed directly into the spot where he'd been sitting. The lesson, in the Navy, orders kept the ship running. In the universe, instinct kept the soul alive. The Templar in the blue jersey. Oggy wasn't just an engine check specialist. Like Sunking and Cole, he had traveled east, capital A. 32nd degree Mason and a Knight Templar of the York Rite. He saw the carrier not as a warship, but as a floating temple of kinetic energy. On the rare, relaxed days in the calm Pacific, Oggy would take his board. Led by the Navy skiffs, he would drop into the Kitty Hawk's bow wave, a massive, artificial mountain of water generated by 80,000 tons of steel. Surfing that wave, he felt the literal pressure of the world, the 33 joints in his feet vibrating against the hull's resonance. The incident, the unmarked guest. It happened during a night op in the Dragon's Triangle. The radar had gone blank, a total blackout of the electronic suite. Then, without a sound, a craft descended. No wings, no rivets, no markings. It was a matte black, lenticular shape that seemed to absorb the carrier's floodlights. The witness, Oggy, stood on the deck, his engine check gear useless as the craft touched down on the forewire. The passenger, the hatch didn't open, it dissolved, and there, stepping onto the steel of the US Navy, were the reptilians, tall, obsidian-scaled, and vibrating with an ancient, cold authority. They weren't there to fight, they were there for a pickup. Double quote. The NDA. Within an hour, Oggy was in a windowless room. The men in suits didn't ask questions, they handed him a pen. "You saw a weather balloon test, sailor, sign here." Double quote. The 18-bit handshake. Now, in 2003, the sunken signal hits Oggy's secure terminal. The ocean white noise encryption flashes. Asset, Gary London has the pics. Asset, Jason Street, Kits, has the code. Mission, protect the architect. Oggy sat on his bunk, the hum of the ship's nuclear reactors vibrating through his spine. He remembered the cold eyes of the reptilians on the deck. He knew what they were planning for the genetic library in Denver. "They want the blueprints," Oggy whispered, checking his survival knife, the surfers in the rigging. But they forgot about. He opened his secure link to Arthur in London and Cole in St. Kitts. The triangle was now square. Oggy, Pacific node, active. The bow wave is ready. The cubed sphere. USS Kitty Hawk, CV-63, Pacific Theater. July 2008. The Ghostbusters had arrived on the flight deck 3 days ago. Specialists from the Office of Naval Intelligence carrying black box directed energy weapons and specialized sensor arrays. They were there to scrub the sky, but the sky wasn't cooperating. Augustine watched from the LSO platform, his 32nd degree mind analyzing the geometry of the intruders. They weren't drones. A drone has a motor, a battery, a signature. These were anomalies. The geometry of the occupier. The orbs hovered at the edge of the carrier's perimeter. They appeared as translucent spheres encased within dark, rotating cubes. The physics, they ignored the 30-knot winds and the carrier's wake. They existed in a state of zero-point inertia. Double quote. The conflict, when Phalanx CIWS close-in weapon system opened up, the 20mm round simply vanished into a refractive shimmer around the cubes. The rail guns, firing at hypersonic speeds, didn't even cause a dent. The objects would simply blink, disappearing and reappearing 500 yards away in a nanosecond. The pilots lament. The whispers in the lodge at sea were getting louder. During the degree work in the darkened mess hall, pilots from the VFA 102 squadron told Oggy the same story. "They're sitting in our CAP, Combat Air Patrol, stations, Oggy. We fly through the corridor, and there's a cube sphere right in the center of the HUD. We try to lock on, and the radar system screams like it's being fed a virus." One FA-18 had nearly shredded its airframe trying to bank away from a cube that appeared instantly in its flight path. It was spatial dominance. The reptilians weren't just visiting, they were reserving the airspace for the 2026 event. The Templar Protocol, decapitation. Oggy retreated to the quiet of the hangar bay, leaning against a bulkhead. His Templar training, the inner York Rite knowledge passed down through the bloodlines, had a specific, brutal chapter on the entities he had seen on the deck in 2003. The biology, reptilians aren't ghosts. They are high-density biological machines. The weakness, their nervous system is decentralized, but their link to the hive mind is anchored in the brainstem. The Templar manuscripts were clear, only by decapitation can the connection be severed. You don't shoot a reptilian, you have to disconnect it. "They aren't here for the oil," Oggy muttered, looking at his scarred hands. "Blueprints. They're here for the Maui exit." With only a year left in his 20-year hitch, Oggy began to draft his retirement navigation. He was done with the world. The military-industrial complex was a failing shield. The Brotherhood was compromised by the secular owls of the Syndicate. He looked at a map of the Pacific. His finger landed on Maui. The reason, Maui sat on a specific volcanic plume that interfered with the reptilian frequency. It was a dead zone for their surveillance. The goal, to surf the real waves, not the bow waves. To wait for the architect he had been protecting through the encrypted ocean white noise. Double quote. The signal check. Oggy pulled out a small, non-Navy encrypted handset. He checked the ping from the Jacksonville node, Sunking, and the St. Kitts node, Cole. Oggy, 2008 survived. Exiting the matrix soon. Status, the cubes are marking the grid. Advice, tell the architect to watch the skull. Although as yet he did not know it, down in the Caribbean the Chosen One was still in the alcoholic stasis, drinking at Cole's bar, but Oggy could see the 2026 solar maximum looming like a storm on the horizon. He would be in Maui by then. He was perhaps being drawn by unseen forces to be the West Coast shield. The awakening of the Sentinels. The Atlas Command Sphere. High-dimensional anchor point. While Michael finalized the transmission to the architect, Gabriel stood at the secondary console. Gabriel was the director of manifestation. If Michael was the signal, Gabriel was the hardware. The biosynthetic legion. Gabriel began the activation sequence for the unseen guardians. The technology. These were the UFOs witnessed by Oggy, on the Kitty Hawk and Gary in the NASA archives. They weren't nuts and bolts craft in the human sense. They were semi-biosynthetic sentinels, living machines wrapped in gravitic skins. The camouflage, using dimensional warping. These craft didn't fly through the air. They slipped through the atmospheric cage of Earth. They occupied the same space as the Navy jets, but on a frequency that human radar could only catch in fragmented glitches. Double quote. The mission, to shatter the Syndicate's monopoly on reality. Gabriel sent the pulse to increase their presence tenfold. No more weather balloons. It was time for the armies of light to occupy the sky. Mercury's resurrection. Meanwhile, in the residential gardens of the Atlas, the man known as Mercury, the Chosen One's soul echo, awoke. The vitality, he didn't just feel healthy, he felt perfect. The 2026 solar maximum had surged through the ship's hull, interacting with his own 33-joint foundation. He felt a vitality surpassing even his teenage peak, a cellular restoration that made his spine feel like a pillar of light. The neural air, the cannabis terpene, piney air of the ship acted as a bridge. It allowed Mercury to see the real future, his family, his sons, his wife not as memories, but as the inhabitants of the next step. The ship had reassured him, they are the reason for the ark. The forest inspection. Mercury stepped out of his quarters and onto the main observation deck. Beside him, the ghost cat, a feline entity whose consciousness was entangled with the ship's AI, walked with silent, translucent paws. Before him lay the vast forest. It wasn't just a garden, it was the library of life that Zixchine had tried to steal from the Denver Dome. The petrichor scent was overwhelming now, the smell of a world reborn after a long drought. The trees were the spires Gary McKinnon had seen on the moon, but here, they were alive, pulsing with the same 144 frequency as the Ark of the Covenant. Mercury looked at the ghost cat. It's time to inspect the inventory, he whispered. The cat let out a low, resonant purr that vibrated through the deck plates. Gabriel's drones were filling the skies of Earth, and Mercury was standing in the heart of the New Eden, waiting for the architect to bring the rest of the 144,000 home. The gantry of the ancients. The Atlas Biosphere. Upper Tier, the living library. Mercury's first footsteps onto the Moss pathway were silent, his 33 joints finally meeting a surface that didn't just support him, it responded to him. The Moss pathway was a velvet soft carpet of bioluminescent lichen that pulsed with a faint 144 Hz hum, acknowledging the arrival of the traveler. The architecture of the unbound. Ahead of him, the forest defied every law of terrestrial biology. The redwood gantries, giant redwoods, taller than anything the Pacific Northwest had ever produced, rose into the misty heights. Their roots didn't just dive into the soil, They reached across the canyons of the ship's interior like giant gantry bridges, weaving the different tiers of the forest into a singular, structural web. The gravity effect, freed from the one-atmosphere crush of Earth's gravity, the trees had grown unrestricted. They were miles high, their bark texture like ancient armor, sheltering an ecosystem that felt both primordial and futuristic. The respiration of the vessel. The air was the freshest Mercury had ever breathed, a living, moving thing. The Atlas breathed through the forest. The gentle breeze Mercury felt was the ship's internal atmospheric cycle, entirely purified by the vegetation. The cannabis tier, in the upper sections, bathed in the concentrated solar maximum light, grew the super tier of cannabis. These weren't mere plants, they were miles-long sections of high-altitude rainforest canopy, dripping with resin and moisture. The air was thick with the piney terpene scent, a neural balm that finally silenced the last echoes of the old world in his mind. The reptilian lie. As he pushed forward through the surreal beauty, Mercury remembered the classified briefings from his days on the Kitty Hawk and the whispers in the Masonic Lodge. The deception. The reptilian voice and the Syndicate generals had told him the craft's interior was a derelict wasteland, a cold, metallic husk. They wanted the soldiers to believe the library was just data, something they could extract and weaponize. The truth. Standing here, Mercury saw the fraud. The interior wasn't a wreck, it was a thriving biosystem. It was a new Eden that had been waiting for the anointed to walk its paths. The surreal reality. He felt tiny, a singular point of consciousness in a cathedral of life that stretched for miles. Yet, for the first time in his life, he didn't feel insignificant. He felt calibrated. The ghost cat trotted ahead, its tail twitching as it navigated a root bridge. "It's not derelict," Mercury whispered, his hand brushing against the bark of a tree that vibrated with the power of 1,000 suns. "It's awake." He pushed further into the verdant depths, the petrichor scent guiding him toward the heart of the ship, where the 144 frequency was strongest. The reptilian whispers were gone. There was only the sound of the Atlas breathing, and the soft thud of his own feet on the moss, walking toward the future he had been promised. Chapter 24, The Federal Seal. Bohemian Grove, California. July 2008. The smell of the cremation of care hung heavy in the redwood grove, the acrid scent of a simulated sacrifice that, for those at the inner table, was far too real. The CIA director reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $1 bill. He laid it on the rough-hewn table. One by one, the others followed suit, the bankers, the generals, the titans of tech. Each man placed a single bill in the center of the circle, a silent pile of green ink and occult geometry. The blood vow of the vow. This was the solemn exchange. The promise, to utter a single vowel of this conversation outside the circle was to invite the smiting of the owl. They didn't need to sign a contract in blood. The blood was already understood. The penalty, in the mysterious logic of the shadow government, death was not an end, but a disconnection. To betray the circle was to be erased from the genetic library, to be denied the resurrection that the Atlas promised to its loyal servants. The slave offering. They looked toward the altar where the ritual had just concluded. The reality, to the public, it was an effigy. To the men at the table, it was a reminder. The care they cremated was their own humanity. The slave offered to the flames was a symbol of the entire human race. The public they viewed as livestock, to be harvested for Lucian labor. The moral decay, they didn't feel guilt. They felt utter federal power. The owl on the one of the bankers leaned forward, pointing a manicured finger at the tiny, almost invisible owl. Perched in the scrollwork of the dollar bill's upper right corner. The sigil, he's always watching the banker whispered. The federal power doesn't come from the gold in the vault, it comes from the oneness of our secrecy. Double quote. The hierarchy, the bill was a talisman. It signified that they could do whatever they wanted, to the world, and even to each other as long as the owl remained the only witness. The Syndicate's hubris. They each took back a different dollar bill than the one they had placed down. A communion of currency. They believed they had just anchored their power for another decade. They thought they were the only ones who knew about the one. But thousands of miles away, on the Kitty Hawk, Oggy was looking at the same dollar bill in his wallet, his Templar eyes seeing the owl not as a master, but as a target, and on the Atlas. Michael was watching the energy signature of their greed flare on his monitors like a localized cancer. They think the one belongs to them, Michael said, his voice echoing through the terpene-scented deck. They don't realize the one is the very thing that is about to format them. Chapter 25, The Laundry of Ghosts. Secretive media sweep the brain room. Midtown Manhattan, New York. The 11th of March, 2011. On the wall-to-wall monitors, Fox News anchors were speaking in hushed, urgent tones over looped footage of a black wall of water swallowing the Japanese coastline. To the world, it was a tectonic tragedy. To the men in the brain room, it was a cleanup operation. The room was filled with the low hum of high-end servers and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. Here sat the washers, senior editors from the major networks, Pentagon PR liaisons, and a high-level consultant from Zeke's office. The spin of the abyss. The 9.0 magnitude story is holding, but the seismic signature is too clean, a Pentagon liaison muttered, pointing to a raw graph from a deep-sea sensor. A tectonic shift doesn't produce a perfect spherical shockwave. If some independent nerd with a laptop analyzes the hydroacoustic data, they'll see the nuclear signature. The problem: the human Black Ops team had used a tritium-augmented warhead to vaporize the reptilian undersea base. The tsunami was the displacement. The mission: the brain room had to wash the event. They needed to pivot the narrative from the cause to the consequence. The Fukushima breadcrumb. Focus on the nuclear plant, the Zeke's consultant ordered. If we make the story about the meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi, the public will be too terrified of radiation to ask why the seafloor exploded 10 miles out. The big lie: it was a natural disaster. The breadcrumb: admit that the safety protocols failed at the plant. Give them a villain, the power company, to hate, so they don't look for the silent war beneath the waves. The Washington wash. This was the washing of the Pentagon's dark agenda. They discussed how to frame the radiation as a global threat to justify the continued buildup of the CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense budgets. We keep the fear high, a journalist head whispered. Fear is the only thing that keeps the Brookings lid on. If they aren't scared of the radiation, they might start wondering what made the water move in the first place. The mirror of the grove. The men in the room exchanged looks. They remembered the $1 ritual at the Grove in 2008. They knew that the owl was watching this broadcast. They weren't journalists, they were alchemists of perception. They were turning the lead of a secret military strike into the gold of a climate event. The watcher's interference. While they calibrated the spin, a single terminal in the back of the room glitched. For a split second, a frame of Gary McKinnon's 2002 NASA hack flashed on the main screen, a high-res image of a non-terrestrial ship. The room went silent. What was that? The Fox producer snapped. Just a solar flare, the IT tech lied, his hands trembling. But it wasn't a flare. From the Atlas, Gabriel had sent a micropulse into the Manhattan grid. A reminder to the washers that while they could spin the news, they couldn't spin the truth. The water is rising. Michael's voice echoed in the quantum-entangled space is running out. And their soap. The mark of the news. Fox News HQ, the Green Room. New York City. The 12th of March, 2011. Vanessa, the senior head of the entertainment and weather desk, sat in the makeup chair, her face a mask of professional calm while a stylist applied a layer of high-definition foundation. On her lap sat an iPad, glowing with a forbidden underground forum post that had slipped through the corporate firewalls. The Gematria of the Beast. The post was a simple breakdown of the word fox using the English gematria system, where A equals 6, B equals 12, C equals 18. F equals 6, O equals 15, 1 plus 5 equals 6, X equals 24, 2 plus 4 equals 6. Vanessa stared at the screen. 666. She tried to shrug it off, a nervous laugh escaping her throat. It's just math, she whispered, but the coincidence hit the 33-joint foundation of her intuition. She remembered Revelation 13:18. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast. Right double quotation mark. The 6 had landed exactly on the identity of the brand she represented. The voice of the people was branded with the number of the system. The freaky realization. Vanessa looked in the mirror. She was the face of the weather, the one who had just told millions of people that the Fukushima tsunami was a freak accident of nature. The conflict. She knew the hydroacoustic reports didn't match the natural narrative. A job was a job. The 6-figure salary, the Manhattan apartment, the fame, it was all tied to the fox. But the gematria had planted a seed of sacred doubt that no airbrushing could remove. The forbidden office. Her mind drifted to the brain room, that windowless, reinforced office on the 4th floor. No one was allowed in without a level 4 security clearance, and a direct nod from the washers. The mystery. She had seen senior intelligence heads and Pentagon liaisons entering that room with blood-red folders. The doubt. What were they washing in there? If the name on the building was a 666 code, were they really reporting the news? Or were they broadcasting the script of the beast? The neural static. You're on in 5, Vanessa, the producer's voice crackled in her earpiece. She stood up, her 33-jointed feet feeling heavy on the carpet. She adjusted her suit, the same red color that Oggy was seeing on the streets of Maui. The signal. She walked toward the studio lights, but her eyes kept glancing at the security door of the brain room. Double quote. The Watcher's influence. From the Atlas, Michael had triggered this realization. He didn't need to hack her computer, he just needed to nudge her pattern recognition. Good morning, America, Vanessa said to the camera, her smile perfect, her heart cold. Today's forecast calls for continued visibility. But as she spoke, she realized she was no longer looking at the weather. She was looking for the owls in the rafters. The spin was beginning to make her dizzy, and for the first time, the weather girl realized that a storm was coming that no broadcast could predict. Chapter 26, The Kola Echo. The Kremlin, Star City, Russia. December, 2011. In the cold, high-ceilinged rooms of the Kremlin, the conversation was not about weather balloons. The Russian High Command had the burn logs, data from Su-27s that had simply vanished in the Siberian wilderness, and naval destroyers in the Kuril Islands that had been disabled by electronic vampirism. 1. The Open Coffin Protocol. The Russians lived with the horrific accidents of the space race as a badge of cold reality. They remembered Vladimir Komarov in 1967, his body reduced to a charred lump in an open coffin, a gruesome reminder that the 1-atmosphere barrier was a lethal gatekeeper. The Russian view. Space was a graveyard of mistakes. They didn't airbrush the failures like NASA, they used them to harden the resolve of the Sentinels. The conflict. They knew the Americans weren't just exploring. Their intelligence group had tracked the NASA airbrushed protocol to the lunar far side. They knew the spires Gary McKinnon saw were being occupied by a joint syndicate reptilian force. 2. The Kola Superdeep, the 10-mile audit. Frustrated by the lunar gate, the Russians had turned their attention downward. For years, they had bored the Kola Superdeep borehole, reaching a depth of over 7.5 miles, 12,262 meters. The clue. They weren't looking for oil, they were looking for the underground highway. The discovery. At the 10-mile target depth, the drills had encountered heat anomalies and acoustic screams that defied geological explanation. They had tapped into the subterranean transit system, the same one the Denver Arc would eventually use to phase through the crust. 3. The lunar incursion. Russian satellites had captured what the Fox washers would never show: incursions originating from the moon and disappearing into the Earth's crust. The intelligence. They knew the American shadow government was trading human genetic material for gravitic technology. Double quote. The Russian response. They talked more freely about UFOs in the public sphere, to keep their population combat ready. To them, the UFO wasn't a mystery, it was an empirical enemy. The Great Seal Echo. The closed city of Serov, Russia. January 2012. Deep within the restricted zones of the Russian nuclear complex, the GRU, main intelligence directorate, was auditing the visitors. It was a known fact among the high-ranking owls of the East, atomic reactors are beacons. 1. The reactor magnet. The Russians had observed that their nuclear facilities acted as feeding stations for crypto-terrestrial scouts. The retrieval, in the vast, frozen stretches of the Ural Mountains. They had recovered craft that didn't crash because of mechanical failure, but because they had overcharged on the localized radiation. The silence, unlike the flashy reverse engineering of Area 51, the Russian progress grew in a state of understated awe. They didn't build black triangles, they built invisibles. 2. The thing, passive eavesdropping. The crowning jewel of their reverse engineering was the resonant cavity microphone. The tech, inspired by the recovered UFO material, they developed a device that required no battery and no internal power source. It was a passive diaphragm that, when hit by a specific microfrequency from a distance, would vibrate with the voices in the room reflect the signal back to a recorder. The logic, they realized the UFOs weren't broadcasting, they were reflecting. The entities used the Earth's own electromagnetic field as a carrier wave for their thoughts. 3. The infiltration, owls versus scales. The Russian government, like the American Syndicate, was a hive of infiltration. The reptilians, these entities had embedded themselves in the military command, pushing for dominance and hard power. Double quote. The owls, the human elite, the owls, played a more cynical game. Their bar for morality was so low it didn't exist. They used the reptilian technology to spy on their own people, realizing that information is the only currency. They didn't care about the secret of the universe, they cared about who was talking in the room next door. Chapter 27, The Sealer and the Sower. The Inner Crust, Sector 33, Sub-Pacific. Deep beneath the crust, far below the Kola Superdeep and the human deepest holes, lay the crystal city of the sower. This wasn't a city of brick and mortar, but of structured light, a subterranean vault, where the Earth's core energy was filtered through massive quartz lattices. 1. The sower's ascent. The sower, an entity of the One Mind, received the marker from the surface gardener. The reptilians had moved. Their greed had finally pushed them to the threshold of the surface. The transit, the sower didn't use elevators. He stepped into the exotic polymer tubes, ancient, biosynthetic veins lined with frictionless polymers that lined the natural lava tubes of the Earth. The maneuver, utilizing phase velocity, he surged toward the surface, moving hundreds of miles in minutes, passing through the irony of measures that humans called the crust. 2. The sealer handshake. As the sower broke the atmospheric barrier near the volcanic vents of Maui, the sealer was waiting. The marker, the sealer caught the data packet from the sower. It was the entry/exit log of the reptilian fleet, the proof of their genetic theft. Double quote. The anchor, the sealer then performed its primary function. It locked its gravitic drive onto a single coordinate, anchored to the One. It became an invisible sentinel, a stationary point in a moving world, prepared to watch for eons if necessary. 3. The feed to the One. The sealer began the transmission. The data didn't go to a satellite. It went to the One Mind at the galactic center, reflected through the atlas. The intelligence, every movement of the reptilian shadow overlords was now being mapped. Their invisible incursions were now glowing on the atlas monitors like flares in the dark. The purpose, to ensure that when the solar maximum hit its 33-degree peak, there would be no place for the entities of entropy to hide. The abyssal aperture. Stationary anchor point, 50,000 ft. The Pacific-Antarctic Ridge/Pacific Interface, Sentinel Entity, Sealer 09. To understand how the sealer sees, one must discard the human concept of a camera. The sealer operates on the electron lattice overlaid ELO, It perceives the universe as a singular, interconnected web of quantum probability. 1. The vision of atomic structure. The Sealer's eyes are gravitic sensors that detect the vibration of the void. The surface layer, to the Sealer, the topsoil of Earth is a translucent skin. It sees the atomic structure of the basaltic rock not as a solid, but as a vibrating geometry of carbon and silica. The underside audit, because it tracks the muon flux, subatomic particles that rain down through the planet, it can see through miles of solid crust. It observes the underside of the tectonic plates, as clearly as a human sees the underside of a leaf held to the sun. 2. The engineering of perception. The Sealer sees by calculating the resistance of the lattice. The electron lattice, every atom in the universe is plugged into a universal grid. When a reptilian craft or a dumb entrance exists, it creates a displacement in this grid. The overlay, the Sealer overlays the ideal universe, the perfect 144 frequency, over the local reality. Where the two don't match, it detects a shadow. This is how it finds the hidden. 3. Findings, the doorway to the dumb. Anchored above the Pacific, the Sealer 9 focuses its vision on the coordinates provided by the Gardener. The Sealer's log, target, location, 2 miles east of Dulce Base, New Mexico, Archuleta Mesa. Depth, 4.2 miles below ground level. Finding, the doorway is not a physical gate, but a frequency portal. It is a localized field, where the atmospheric cage has been thinned to allow the passage of high-density biologicals, reptilians. Detail, I perceive the exotic polymer tubes as glowing ribbons of negative resistance. They are lined with a synthetic material that mimics the ghost cats. Phasing ability, I see 12 reptilian worker-class entities currently at the 3-mile mark, transporting genetic silos, the stolen library, toward the surface lava tubes. 4. The description of the vault. The Sealer describes the interior of the dumb not as a base, but as a parasitic hive. Structure, the walls are grown, not built, a mix of obsidian and a biosynthetic resin that feeds on the Earth's geothermal heat. The overlords, at the center of the vault, the Sealer detects the deep overlords. They are cold in the lattice, spots of zero resonance where empathy has been entirely replaced by greed frequency. The feed to the architect. The Sealer doesn't just record this, it streams the vibration directly to Atlas Monolith. The Sealer sees the door, it's not a secret anymore, it's a target. The Sealer remains silent, its vision locked on the electron lattice. The doorway is wide open, and for the first time in eons, the one is looking straight inside. In the depths of the southern dome, anchored within the Pitman fracture, the air is thick with the scent of ozone and biosynthetic decay. Vane second in command, a high-level Syndicate operative whose soul has been traded for a seat at the table, stares at the primary holoscreen. He is no longer looking at the spin for Fox. He is looking at the raw geometry of the end. The reckoning math. The southern dome, command tower. Pacific-Antarctic Ridge interface. The operative, codenamed Silas, watches the telemetry. The Sealer and the Aeon, the eye orbs, are no longer circling the perimeter. They are closing the gap. 1. The shrinking perimeter. Silas notes with a cold dread that the distance between the sentinels and the base's frequency shield is decreasing at a constant, non-linear rate. The math of the invasion, it isn't a military maneuver, it's an algorithm of encirclement. Every hour, the Sealer drones move exactly 1/33 closer to the interface. It's a geometric progression that leads to a single point, 0 hour. The Earth's pulse, the uptick in tectonic activity isn't natural. The Earth's crust is vibrating in sympathy with the Atlas. The atmospheric cage is buckling under the pressure of the 144 frequency. 2. The DNA harvest, the pilot variable. Silas pulls up the encrypted files on the Navy pilot DNA. This was the secret Vane had guarded since the 2004 Nimitz encounters. The question, had they managed to decode why certain pilots could see the cubes while others saw only static? The findings, the DNA wasn't just being studied, it was being used as a biological key. The Syndicate had been trying to replicate the pilot's extended vision to weaponize the Sealar's own technology, but the data shows a 99% failure rate. The human biology rejects the reptilian graft every time. 3. The message to Vane. Silas fingers the haptic keys, sending a burst transmission to Vane at the surface. 2. Vane et al. From Silas, Seccom / Southern Dum. Data: the Sealer are within 5 miles of the primary hull. The AN are mapping our electron lattice in real time. The Earth is singing against us. Status: the pilot DNA recombination is unstable. We cannot turn the key. The reckoning is calculated for the solar maximum. We are trapped in the hole. 4. The shadow in the vault. As Silas sends the message, he feels a presence behind him, one of the abominable gardeners moving through the outer polymer tubes. The gardeners aren't attacking, they are simply waiting. They know the math. They know the Sealer is the Sealer, the pause, and the AN is the eye. The Syndicate thought they were the ones doing the auditing, but as the distance to the Sealer decreases, Silas realizes the truth: they are the ones being audited. He's not coming to save us, Silas whispers, looking at the screen where the 5555 signal is flashing. Vane is just as much a slave as the people on the surface. Double quote. Chapter 28, The Full Spectrum Code. Syndicate Biolab, Sector 4, Sub-Pacific Dum. The 9th of February, 2012. Vane stepped into the sanitized, blue-lit laboratories. In the center of the room, suspended in a nutrient-rich, zero-gravity stasis field, was the pilot, the Atlas entity captured during a tactical intercept. Vane ignored the man's physical form and looked instead at the massive glass wall display behind him. It showed the Nimitz sequence in a 4D rendering that pulsed with a soft, gold light. 1. The density of truth. In human science, the majority of DNA is dismissed as junk DNA or non-coding sequences. But on Vane's screen, the pilot's genetic map was a solid, vibrating pillar of information. The junk is the library. There were no empty spaces. Every base pair was part of an intricate, fractal code. It was as if the universe had compressed its entire history: the birth of stars, the construction of the Atlas, the blueprints of the Crystal City into a single biological thread. The perfection: the DNA didn't just carry instructions for protein synthesis, it carried the 144 frequency itself. It was a self-correcting, living antenna. 2. The hybrid equation. Vane's eyes were bloodshot, reflected in the glow of the data feed. He was obsessed with the encoding process. The goal: to splice this full-spectrum DNA into the Syndicate's hybrid soldiers, the brass-necked enforcers and reptilian human grafts. The theory: if he could encode just a fraction of this sequence, his hybrids wouldn't just be stronger. They would have the command access to the inner Earth lava tubes and the Atlas itself. They would become the false architects. Double quote. 3. The risk: the soul crash. As he stared at the perfect entity in the tank, Vane contemplated the consequences of the graft. The mutation: if you force universe-level data into a soul-deadened hybrid, the biological system would likely undergo a spontaneous frequency collapse. The hybrid wouldn't just die, it would literally unmake itself into raw energy. The ascension threat: if the graft did work, the hybrid might instantly remember its connection to the One Mind and turn on Vane. To give a slave the code of the universe is to invite an immediate mutiny of the soul. The final decision. Vane leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the stasis tank. He could hear the low hum of the Sealer drones outside the dumb walls, the math of the encirclement getting louder. If I don't use this code, Vane whispered to the unconscious pilot, the gardeners will seal us in this hole forever. If I do use it, I might set a fire I can't put out. He reached for the initiate sequence command on his tablet. The owls had always believed that power was taken. He was about to find out that the universal secret isn't a weapon, it's a requirement. Encode the first 33 sequences, Vane ordered the lab AI. Let's see if the beast can handle the light. Double quote. End part 2.